What if I told you that the most documented genocide in human history still has secrets? That the most studied, the most written about, the most taught atrocity of the 20th century still contains facts so dark, so deliberately buried, so carefully hidden from school textbooks, that most people who think they know the Holocaust have only ever seen the surface? You've heard the numbers. 6 million Jews, 12 million total victims, the gas chambers, the ovens, the camps with their iron gates and their lying slogans. You've seen the photographs, the skeletal survivors, the mountains of shoes, and you've been told, never again. But here's what they didn't tell you in school. The Holocaust didn't start overnight. It was built slowly, deliberately, with paperwork and bureaucracy and corporate contracts and international indifference. It was enabled by ordinary people, funded by companies you still buy products from today, and ignored by governments that had every reason to intervene and chose not to. And when it was over, most of the people who built and ran the machinery of death walked away, changed their names, got new jobs, raised families, died in their beds. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's talk about 50 dark Holocaust facts that your teachers, your textbooks, and sometimes even your governments preferred you didn't know. Every single fact you're about to hear is documented, verified, and sourced from historical records, trial transcripts, survivor testimonies, and declassified documents. But before we begin, do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Because content like this, the uncomfortable kind, the kind that refuses to simplify or sanitize one of history's greatest crimes, doesn't always get pushed by algorithms. And these stories deserve to be heard. Now settle in, let your body relax, and prepare to learn the history they never wanted you to know. Fact 1. The Holocaust began with paperwork, not gas chambers. Let's start somewhere that might surprise you. When most people think about the Holocaust, their minds go immediately to Auschwitz, to the gas chambers, to the crematoria, to the systematic industrial murder that defines the final phase of Nazi genocide. But the Holocaust didn't begin there. It began with a form, with a registration card, with a bureaucrat stamping a document. It is 1933. Adolf Hitler has just been appointed Chancellor of Germany. And before a single camp opens, before a single person is shot or gassed or starved, the Nazi regime begins building a machine of exclusion through law and paperwork. The April 1933 law for the restoration of the professional civil service removes Jewish people from government employment. The April 1st, 1933 nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses is organized and enforced. Signs go up in shop windows, on park benches, on swimming pools. Jews not permitted. Jews unwelcome here. This is important because it tells us something uncomfortable about how genocide works. It doesn't arrive fully formed. It creeps. It normalizes. It takes years of small cruelties before it graduates to large ones. And each small cruelty makes the next one easier to accept. By 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped Jewish people of their citizenship entirely. They are no longer Germans. They are subjects. They cannot marry non-Jews. They cannot employ non-Jewish women under the age of 45 in their homes. They cannot fly the German flag. These are not the laws of a country that has suddenly gone mad. These are the laws of a country that has been carefully and systematically taught to see an entire group of people as less than human, through years of propaganda, through controlled media, through the slow erosion of language and law. By the time the first purpose-built death camp, Chelmno, opens in December 1941, the German population has lived under anti-Jewish legislation for 8 years. The machinery of death that we think of as the Holocaust was built on top of a foundation of bureaucratic dehumanization. The men who signed the deportation orders were not monsters who appeared from nowhere. They were clerks, administrators, lawyers, and civil servants who had been promoted through a system that rewarded obedience to increasingly monstrous directives. The Holocaust is not a story about evil descending from above. It is a story about how ordinary systems, filled with ordinary people, can be directed toward extraordinary horror, one policy, one form, one signature at a time. And speaking of signatures on documents, let's talk about one specific afternoon that changed everything. Fact 2. The Wannsee Conference lasted 90 minutes, January 20th, 1942. A Tuesday. 15 high-ranking Nazi officials gather in a beautiful villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee, just outside Berlin. The villa is elegant, with high ceilings, a grand dining room, manicured grounds overlooking the water. It is the kind of place where wealthy Germans host dinner parties. On this particular Tuesday, the men who gather there are doing something rather different. They are coordinating the murder of every Jewish person in Europe. The meeting is chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Main Security Office, one of the most powerful and feared men in the Third Reich. He is tall, blonde, athletic, and so efficient in his cruelty that Hitler reportedly called him the man with the iron heart. Adolf Eichmann takes the minutes. 15 men sit at the table. They represent every major arm of the German state, the SS, the Nazi Party, the Foreign Office, the Justice Ministry. They eat, they drink cognac, and they discuss, in bureaucratic language so calm and measured it turns the stomach, the logistics of murdering 11 million people. The conference does not decide to commit the Holocaust. That decision had already been made and implementation had already begun. What Wannsee does is coordinate. It ensures that every agency of the German state is aligned, informed, and committed to what Heydrich's minutes call the final solution to the Jewish question. The minutes of the meeting, discovered after the war by an American lieutenant colonel named Robert Kempner, refer to 11 million Jews across occupied Europe and beyond, including those in countries Germany doesn't even control yet, like Ireland, Portugal, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. They had already mapped out everyone they intended to kill. The most chilling thing about the Wannsee Conference is not what was said. It is how briefly it needed to be said. The entire meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes. Less time than it takes to watch most films. Less time than a single university lecture. 90 minutes to coordinate the murder of millions of people. Then the men had lunch. The Wannsee Protocol, the meeting's official minutes, survived the war because Eichmann, following standard bureaucratic procedure, made 30 copies. Only one survived. It is now housed at the house of the Wannsee Conference Memorial, which has been established in that same villa. You can visit it. You can walk through those rooms and know what was decided there in 90 minutes over cognac on a winter afternoon in 1942. And if you think the Holocaust was carried out purely by Nazi Party fanatics with no involvement from the private sector, let's talk about the company that provided the technology that made it all possible. Fact 3. IBM provided the technology that made the Holocaust efficient. Here is a name you probably weren't expecting in a conversation about the Holocaust. International Business Machines. IBM. In 1933, IBM's founder and president Thomas J. Watson personally traveled to Germany and established a close working relationship with the Nazi government. The German subsidiary of IBM, Die Hamag, provided the Third Reich with custom-designed punch card systems, mechanical computers that could sort and categorize population data on a massive scale. And those machines were used to track, categorize, and ultimately locate Jewish people across occupied Europe. Here's how it worked. The German census of 1933, taken shortly after Hitler came to power, used IBM punch card technology to sort the population by religion. Every person who was identified as Jewish was cataloged and recorded. When the Nazis began their deportations, the punch card systems allowed them to identify, sort by location, cross-reference by profession and age, and schedule Jewish people for deportation with industrial efficiency. The same technology was used in the concentration camps to catalog prisoner numbers, track mortality rates, and record labor assignments. IBM was not ignorant of this. The leasing contracts for the machines, the technical maintenance, the customized car designs specifically for the concentration camp systems, all required ongoing communication between IBM's New York headquarters and its German operations. IBM machines were present at Auschwitz. IBM machines were used to track the census data that identified who would be rounded up. The Hollerith machine number, often tattooed or marked on documents, was an IBM punch card designation. Author Edwin Black documented this extensively in his 2001 book IBM and the Holocaust, drawing on thousands of documents from archives across the world. IBM disputed some of his conclusions, but did not challenge the fundamental facts of their involvement. Thomas J. Watson received the Merit Cross of the German Eagle from Hitler's government in 1937. He returned it in 1940, after the invasion of Poland had made the optics difficult. This is not ancient history with no modern relevance. It is a documented case of a major American corporation providing essential infrastructure to a genocidal regime, maintaining that relationship through years of increasingly obvious atrocities, and facing essentially no consequences afterward. IBM thrived in the post-war period. Watson was celebrated as a business visionary. The executives who maintained the German contracts did not stand trial at Nuremberg. Corporate complicity in the Holocaust, which extended far beyond IBM to include many German and international companies, has largely been treated as a historical footnote rather than a moral reckoning. And speaking of systems designed to process human beings with efficiency, let's talk about the people who were forced to operate those systems from the inside. Fact 4. The Sonderkommando were prisoners forced to operate the gas chambers. There is perhaps no more psychologically devastating role in the entire machinery of the Holocaust than the Sonderkommando, the Special Squad. And understanding what they were forced to do tells you something essential about how the Nazis constructed their murder system and how deeply they understood human psychology. The Sonderkommando were Jewish prisoners, overwhelmingly Jewish, selected upon arrival at the death camps for a specific and terrible purpose. They were forced to work in the crematoria, to guide new arrivals into the undressing rooms, to collect and sort clothing, to pull gold teeth from the mouths of the dead, to cut the hair from women's corpses, to drag bodies from the gas chambers to the ovens, to operate the furnaces, to carry the ashes. These men were given better food than other prisoners. They lived in relative comfort compared to the general camp population. They knew what was happening to every person who arrived. They sometimes recognized family members, neighbors, people from their own towns, walking through the doors they guarded. And they could say nothing, do nothing, without being killed immediately. The SS designed this system with deliberate psychological cruelty. By forcing Jewish prisoners to participate in the murder of Jewish victims, they hoped to spread guilt, to make the Sonderkommando complicit, to ensure that survivors could not speak without implicating themselves. It was a calculated degradation of human dignity, and the Sonderkommando knew what awaited them. The SS periodically killed entire Sonderkommando units and replaced them with new arrivals, ensuring that as few witnesses as possible survived. A Sonderkommando prisoner named Salman Gradowski buried manuscripts in the ash heap at Auschwitz-Birkenau, hoping they would be found after the war. They were. He wrote, "Dear finder, search everywhere, in every inch of soil. Dozens of documents are buried under it, mine and those of other persons, which will shed light on everything that happened here." Approximately 800 to 1,000 men served in the Sonderkommando at Auschwitz-Birkenau at any given time. Very few survived the war. Those who did face suspicion and stigma afterward, sometimes from other survivors who did not understand the impossible coercion under which they had operated. Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, and other chroniclers of the Holocaust wrote extensively about the moral complexity of their situation. The Sonderkommando were not collaborators in any meaningful sense. They were victims who were made instruments of murder at the cost of their own sanity and souls. And if the Sonderkommando represent the human cost of the gas chamber system, let's talk about the man whose name has become almost synonymous with the worst of what science became inside those camps. Fact 5. Josef Mengele conducted experiments that no textbook will fully describe. Josef Mengele arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau in May 1943. He was 32 years old. He had a doctorate in anthropology and a medical degree. He wore white gloves and carried a riding crop. He stood on the selection platform as transports arrived, often humming operatic arias, and with a casual flick of his hand, directed people left or right. Left to the gas chambers, right to the slave labor barracks. He did this thousands of times. But Mengele's particular infamy comes not from the selections, which every SS officer at Auschwitz performed, but from what he did inside his laboratory block, Block 10, and the experimental barracks. Mengele was obsessed with twins. He believed that studying identical twins could unlock the genetic secrets of heredity and help him advance the Nazi racial ideology that superior characteristics could be bred and engineered. When twins arrived on the transports, he called them his children. He gave them extra food. He called them by name. He patted their heads. And then he experimented on them. The nature of these experiments has been documented through survivor testimony, post-war trial records, and the findings of forensic investigators. Mengele conducted forced surgeries without anesthesia. He injected chemicals into children's eyes attempting to change their color, causing excruciating pain and sometimes blindness. He injected diseases into one twin to see how the other, genetically identical, twin responded. He sewed twins together surgically, attempting to create artificial conjoined twins. He performed blood transfusions between twins, replacing one's blood with the other's. He amputated limbs and organs. He conducted experiments in pressure chambers and freezing tanks. And when he was done with a twin, or when one twin in a pair died from an experiment, he killed the other in order to perform simultaneous autopsies. Approximately 1,400 twins passed through Mengele's program at Auschwitz. Perhaps 200 survived. Many of the survivors spent their entire lives dealing with the physical and psychological consequences of what was done to them. A survivor named Eva Moses Kor, who was 10 years old when she arrived at Auschwitz with her twin sister Miriam, spent decades campaigning for recognition of the survivors. She forgave Mengele publicly in 1995, a decision that was deeply controversial among survivors and drew both admiration and condemnation. She died in 2019. Mengele himself escaped justice. After the war, he fled to South America, living in Argentina, Paraguay, and finally Brazil, where he died of a stroke while swimming in 1979. He was never captured. He was never tried. He lived for 34 years after the war ended, under a series of assumed identities, protected by networks of former Nazis and South American governments. His bones were exhumed and identified through DNA testing in 1985. Some of his victims were still alive at that time. And speaking of victims whose scale is almost incomprehensible, let's talk about the most devastating single category of victims in the Holocaust. Fact 6. 1.5 million children were murdered in the Holocaust. There is no way to say this gently, so we will say it plainly. Of the 6 million Jewish people murdered in the Holocaust, approximately 1.5 million were children. Children under the age of 15. Infants. Toddlers. Children who were in school, learning to read, drawing pictures, dreaming about what they would be when they grew up. 1.5 million of them were murdered. In the death camps, particularly Operation Reinhard camps like Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, which we will discuss in detail later, children were almost universally killed immediately upon arrival. They were considered economically useless to the slave labor system. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the SS physician conducting selections would look at a child and direct them to the gas chambers. Mothers who try to keep their children with them, rather than send them to a separate line where they might have had a chance, usually condemned themselves and their children together. The children of the Lodz ghetto were taken in September 1942 during what became known as the Gesperre, the curfew. For 8 days, SS and ghetto police went building to building, ripping children from their parents. Children under 10 and adults over 65 were taken. Chaim Rumkowski, the chairman of the Jewish Council who has gone down in history as one of the most controversial figures of the Holocaust, gave a speech on September 4, 1942, in which he begged the ghetto's inhabitants to surrender their children. He said, "Give me your sick. Give me your old. Give me your children. I must cut off the limbs in order to save the body." 20,000 people were deported from the Lodz ghetto during those 8 days. Almost all of them went to Chelmno and were murdered within hours. The children of the Warsaw Ghetto were collected in an Umschlagplatz, a collection point near the railway. Thousands of children wandered the streets of the ghetto, orphaned and starving, the Polaczki, the little birds they were called, begging for scraps of food. When Janusz Korczak, a famous Polish Jewish educator and children's author, was ordered to bring the children from his orphanage to the Umschlagplatz in August 1942, he was offered the chance to escape. He refused. He walked with his 192 children to the collection point and boarded the train to Treblinka with them. He was never seen again. The children who survived the war often bore invisible wounds that lasted their entire lives. The psychological trauma of what they witnessed, what was done to them, and who they lost defined their existence. Many survivors who were children during the Holocaust have spoken of a specific, particular grief, not only for what they suffered, but for the person they might have been, the childhood they should have had, the world that was stolen from them before they were old enough to understand it. And speaking of groups that were targeted with particular and deliberate violence, let's talk about the killing operations that preceded the camps, the ones that operated in the open air, in daylight, with rifles and pits. Fact 7. The Einsatzgruppen killed 2 million people before the camps were even fully operational. When people think about the Holocaust, they almost always think about the camps, about Auschwitz and Treblinka and the gas chambers. But before the death camps reached their full killing capacity, before the industrial system was in place, the Nazis conducted a wave of mass murder that was brutally direct, unmediated, and utterly shattering in its scale. These were the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, for Einsatzgruppen, each divided into smaller units called Einsatzkommandos and Sonderkommandos, followed behind the advancing Wehrmacht. Their mission was explicit: to kill all Jewish people in the occupied territories, to kill Soviet political commissars, to kill Roma people, to kill anyone deemed a threat or a racial enemy. They were given this mission in orders written, signed, and distributed through official military channels. The methodology was simple and horrifying. The Einsatzgruppen would move into a town or village. They would round up the Jewish population, often through deception, telling people they were being resettled or that they needed to gather for registration. They would march them to a nearby forest, ravine, or open field. They would force them to dig pits or trenches. They would strip them of their valuables and clothing, and then they would shoot them. Babi Yar, which we will discuss as its own fact shortly, was the single largest operation. But Babi Yar was not an exception. It was representative of hundreds of similar massacres carried out across Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and the occupied territories of the Soviet Union. In Ponary, outside Vilnius, approximately 70,000 people were shot. In Rumbula, outside Riga, 25,000 people were shot over 2 days in November and December 1941. In Kharkov, in Kaunas, in Minsk, in town after town across the occupied East, the Einsatzgruppen dug pits and shot Jews. By the time the death camps were fully operational in 1942 and 1943, the Einsatzgruppen had already killed an estimated 2 million people. 2 million people shot by men, with rifles in forests and fields. The commanders of these units later stood trial at Nuremberg in what became known as the Einsatzgruppen trial. 14 death sentences were handed down. Most were later commuted. Only 4 men were actually executed for the murders of approximately 2 million people. One Einsatzgruppe commander, Otto Ohlendorf, supervised the murder of 90,000 people in Ukraine and the Crimea between June 1941 and June 1942. At his trial, he was asked whether he had moral objections to what he was doing. He said the order came from the Führer and that it was no different from states executing individuals for criminal acts. He was executed in 1951. Others served a few years and were released. Most lived long lives. And a journalist named Christopher Browning wrote a book about one specific unit of ordinary policemen who did the killing. It is worth understanding who these men were. Fact 8. The men who did the killing were ordinary in 1992. Historian Christopher Browning published a book called Ordinary Men that shook the historical and moral world of Holocaust scholarship. The book examined Reserve Police Battalion 101, a unit of middle-aged German men, many of them too old for the military draft, who were sent to Poland in 1942 and participated in the murder of approximately 83,000 Jewish people in 18 months. These were not hardened SS fanatics. They were not ideologically extreme. They were ordinary men. Shopkeepers, dock workers, craftsmen from Hamburg. Many had families. Many were members of no particular political organization. Some were not even Nazi Party members. And when they arrived in Poland and were first ordered to participate in a mass shooting at Josef on July 13, 1942, their commander, Major Wilhelm Trapp, reportedly wept as he gave the order. And then he gave it. Trapp told his men that morning that if any of them felt unable to participate in the shooting, they could step aside. He was not required to offer them this choice. He chose to. And here is the most important and most disturbing finding of Browning's research. Only a handful of men stepped aside. The majority participated, not because they were ordered to without alternative, not because they were in immediate physical danger if they refused, but because of social pressure, peer conformity, and the desire not to appear weak or different in front of their colleagues. The psychological mechanisms that allowed ordinary men to participate in mass murder were not unique to Germans or to Nazis or to the 1940s. Social psychology research by Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo in the decades after the war demonstrated repeatedly that ordinary people, given institutional authority and social pressure, will engage in behaviors they would find morally monstrous in other contexts. Browning's findings were controversial. Some scholars argued that the men had more choice than his analysis suggested, that the ideology of anti-Semitism was more central than he acknowledged. Others argued that he had understated the degree of genuine coercion. But the fundamental finding, that the people who did the killing were not a special category of monster, that they were recognizably human in ways that make us deeply uncomfortable, has never been seriously challenged. After the war, the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 went home. Most of them. West German investigations in the 1960s looked at their cases. Almost all were found to have not personally killed anyone, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The statute of limitations had run on most applicable charges. Very few faced any legal consequences at all. And speaking of the impossible situations that ordinary people were forced into, let's talk about the Jewish councils, the Judenrat, and the devastating choices they were given. Fact 9. The Jewish councils were given impossible choices and condemned either way in every ghetto the Nazis established across occupied Europe. They appointed or forced the existing Jewish community leadership to form a council, the Judenrat, the Jewish Council. These councils were given a specific and terrible function. They were to serve as the administrative intermediary between the Nazi authorities and the Jewish population. They organized food distribution, housing, sanitation, work assignments, and social services within the ghettos. And they received orders from the SS and the German civil administration. Those orders eventually included selecting people for deportation. The history of the Judenrat is one of the most ethically complex and contested areas of Holocaust scholarship. Hannah Arendt's 1963 book Eichmann in Jerusalem controversially argued that the Jewish councils have facilitated the Holocaust through their cooperation with Nazi demands. This argument was deeply painful to survivors and their descendants, and has been extensively challenged by subsequent scholarship. But the underlying question remains difficult. What were these men supposed to do? Consider the position of Adam Cherniakow, the chairman of the Warsaw Judenrat. He negotiated with the German authorities almost daily, trying to secure food, medical supplies, exemptions from deportation for specific workers or categories of people. He maintained detailed diaries that have survived and been published. In July 1942, when the Germans ordered him to provide 6,000 Jewish people per day for deportation to Treblinka, he understood what deportation meant. He had already understood for some time. He refused the order. He could not comply, and he took poison and died in his office on July 23, 1942. His suicide note read, in part, "I am powerless. My heart trembles in sorrow and compassion. I can no longer bear all this." Chaim Rumkowski of the Lodz ghetto made a different choice. He cooperated extensively with German demands, believing, or claiming to believe, that by maintaining order and maximizing economic productivity in the ghetto, he could preserve the largest possible number of lives by making the ghetto indispensable to the German war economy. He had children taken. He signed deportation orders. He was deported himself to Auschwitz in August 1944, where he was killed, possibly by fellow Jewish prisoners who recognized him. There is no clean moral judgment available on these men. They operated in conditions of existential terror, with no good options, under an authority that would have found another way to achieve its goals whether or not any individual council cooperated. But the weight of the choices they made, and the weight of the choices that were denied to them, sits heavily in the historical record. Your eyelids are beginning to feel heavier now. The weight of these histories pressing gently down. Let the darkness behind your eyes be restful, because there is more to learn, and the learning matters. And speaking of methods that the Nazis used before settling on their most efficient technology, let's talk about what preceded the gas chambers. Fact 10. The Nazis used gas vans before they built gas chambers. The gas chamber is the technology most associated in the public mind with the Holocaust. But before the first gas chamber was built at a death camp, the Nazis developed a more mobile predecessor, the gas van, a sealed truck in which victims were loaded and killed by carbon monoxide from the engine's exhaust, which was piped into the sealed cargo compartment. Gas vans were first used in the occupied Soviet Union in late 1941 by Einsatzgruppen units that were looking for a less psychologically demanding method of mass murder. The shooting operations were taking a toll on the men doing them. Senior SS officers, including Himmler himself, had observed mass shootings and found them disturbing to witness. The gas van was, from the Nazi perspective, an attempt to find a more efficient and less emotionally difficult method for those doing the killing. The first stationary gas chambers, using carbon monoxide from pressurized tanks, were established at the Operation Reinhard camps, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka in 1942. Chelmno used only gas vans throughout its operation, killing an estimated 150,000 to 340,000 people in this way. The technology represented one stage in the evolution of Nazi murder methodology, from shooting to gas vans to stationary chambers, to eventually the Zyklon B chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau, which we will address specifically later. The gas vans were put into production by a unit called the Reich Security Main Office and were manufactured by German companies. The drivers who operated them were ordinary police or SS personnel. The vans are described in official documents using administrative language. One report complained that the interior walls required cleaning after each use and requested a modification to make the process more efficient. Another noted that the victims died from suffocation rather than from the carbon monoxide, suggesting the concentration in the vans was not always lethal at the intended speed. These documents, discovered after the war, are housed in various European archives. They demonstrate something that comes up repeatedly in the history of the Holocaust: the bureaucratic matter-of-factness with which mass murder was documented, discussed, and refined by ordinary civil servants and engineers going about what they appear to treat as a technical problem requiring a technical solution. And speaking of how the machinery of death was concealed and normalized even as it was being built, let's discuss something that shows just how aware the Nazis were that what they were doing would be judged harshly by history. Fact 11. The Nazis attempted to destroy the evidence while the war was still being lost in the summer and autumn of 1944, as the Soviet Red Army advanced westward across Ukraine and Poland. The SS and the commanders of the death camps received orders to destroy the evidence of what had taken place. This operation, partially carried out but never completed in time, tells us something essential about the Nazi leadership's awareness that what they had done was not simply a war measure or a political policy, but a crime of world historical proportions that they expected to be judged for. The body disposal operations that became known as Action 1005 began in 1942, under the command of SS-Standartenführer Paul Blobel. Blobel, who had commanded one of the units that carried out the massacre at Babi Yar, was tasked with going back through the occupied territories and exhuming mass graves, burning the bodies, and grinding the bones in a powder that could be scattered or buried where it would not be identified. Jewish prisoners were used for this work, and then killed when it was complete. At the death camps themselves, as the Soviet advance made it clear that the camps would be overrun, the physical infrastructure of murder was dismantled. At Treblinka, which had killed approximately 850,000 to 900,000 people, the entire camp was plowed under. The buildings were demolished. The ground was plowed and planted with lupin. A Ukrainian farmer named Strebel was given the site and built a farmhouse on it. When Soviet investigators arrived in 1944, they found almost nothing. The Treblinka death camp had been almost completely erased. At Auschwitz, the Germans had more time because the Soviet advance slowed at the Vistula. But beginning in November 1944, the gas chambers and crematoria were systematically dynamited. Files were burned. Records were destroyed. In January 1945, as Soviet forces approached, the SS forced approximately 60,000 surviving prisoners on death marches away from the camp, killing those who could not walk. When Soviet soldiers entered the Auschwitz complex on January 27, 1945, they found approximately 7,000 survivors, left behind because they were too sick and weak even to march to their deaths. They also found warehouses containing hundreds of thousands of items: clothing, shoes, eyeglasses, hair, human hair, gathered for use in industrial products. The scale of what the Soviets found at Auschwitz, even after the German attempts to destroy the evidence, was sufficient to document the genocide. But the destruction of Treblinka and other camps means we will never have a complete material record of what occurred. The evidence that the Nazis most wanted to hide is precisely the evidence we most need. What survived their destruction was preserved almost entirely through survivor testimony and the documents that investigators managed to recover from destroyed or captured archives. And your breathing is slower now. Your body settling into the mattress, the pillow, the familiar weight of your bedding. Keep listening. There is still much to learn. And learning, even when it is heavy, is a form of remembrance. And speaking of the evidence that was almost lost, let's talk about an operation that operated almost entirely underground, both literally and figuratively. Fact 12. Babi Yar was not a battle. It was a 2-day massacre of 33,771 people. September 29th and 30th, 1941. Kyiv, Ukraine. The German army has captured the city. Einsatzgruppe is operating in the area. Posters have gone up across the city ordering all Jewish residents to report to a specific location on the morning of September 29th, bringing their documents, money, and valuables, and dressed in warm clothing. The posters suggest this is a resettlement operation. It is not. The ravine at Babi Yar, a Ukrainian phrase meaning old woman's gully, is where they are going. Tens of thousands of Jewish Kyiv residents gathered at the assembly point. The Germans and their Ukrainian auxiliary police marched them through the city, to the outskirts, to the ravine. As they walked, they were stripped of their possessions, their documents, their clothing. By the time they reached Babi Yar, many understood what was happening. There was no exit. SS men and Ukrainian auxiliaries lined them up at the edge of the ravine and shot them. The bodies fell in. When the ravine filled, the shooters moved position. This continued all day on the 29th and all day on the 30th. At the end of 2 days, the Einsatzgruppe's own records documented the number of people killed: 33,771. In 2 days, at a single location. The numbers were so precise because the shooters counted. Because their kill count was a performance metric that was reported up the chain of command. The commander who filed the report on the Babi Yar massacre received a commendation for efficiency. Babi Yar did not end after those 2 days. The ravine became a site of continuous mass murder throughout the German occupation of Kyiv. Soviet prisoners of war, Romani people, Ukrainian nationalists, patients from a psychiatric hospital, and thousands more Jewish people who had survived the first deportation were killed at Babi Yar over the following years. Total estimates of those killed at Babi Yar range from 100,000 to 150,000 people. In September 1943, As the Soviet army approached, Global's Action 1005 unit arrived at Babi Yar to exhume and burn the bodies. Jewish prisoners from the nearby Sirets concentration camp were brought in chains to do the work. Some managed to escape during a revolt on September 29, 1943, the second anniversary of the massacre. Of the 329 prisoners who attempted to escape, only 15 survived. A monument at Babi Yar exists today. Yevgeny Yevtushenko wrote a poem about Babi Yar in 1961 that was banned in the Soviet Union because it named the Jews specifically, as the Soviets prefer to describe all victims as Soviet citizens. Dmitri Shostakovich set the poem to music in his 13th Symphony. The conductor of the premiere was replaced at the last minute because he feared government retaliation for performing it. And on the 80th anniversary of the massacre, in 2021, a commemorative event at the site was interrupted by a Russian rocket attack on Kiev's television tower, killing 5 people. Babi Yar has never been allowed to simply rest in the past. It keeps being reopened by the present. Fact 13. The Nuremberg laws were explicitly modeled on American Jim Crow legislation. In the summer of 1934, a delegation of Nazi lawyers traveled through the American South. They visited courthouses and legislative buildings. They studied the racial segregation laws of multiple American states, the laws governing interracial marriage, the laws defining racial categories, the laws restricting the rights of Black Americans to vote, to own property, to attend certain schools. And they took extensive notes. James Q. Whitman, a professor of comparative law at Yale, documented this in his 2017 book Hitler's American Model. The book drew on previously underexamined records of a May 1934 meeting of the leading Nazi lawyers and justice officials, in which they explicitly discussed American racial law as a model for what would become the Nuremberg laws. The American racial laws of the Jim Crow era were the most sophisticated and legally developed racial codes in the world in the early 20th century. The United States had been categorizing people by race and constructing legal frameworks of racial exclusion for over 2 centuries. The Nazis looked at this and saw a useful precedent. The records show that at the 1934 meeting, Nazi lawyers cited American laws on miscegenation, the banning of interracial marriage, and the citizenship rules that had been applied to Native Americans and others. The Nuremberg laws, passed in September 1935, established a legal definition of Jewishness based on ancestry. They prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. They stripped Jews of German citizenship. These were not original concepts. They were adaptations of legal technologies that had been developed and refined in the United States over generations, applied to a different targeted group. This does not mean that American racism caused the Holocaust. The historical contexts are different, the outcomes were different, and the scale of Nazi genocidal intent went far beyond anything in American legal history. But it does mean that when we look for where the Nazis found their inspiration for creating a legal framework of racial persecution, they did not need to invent it. They looked westward and found a model already in use. The American eugenics movement, which we will address as its own fact, provided similar inspiration. The Nazis were not creating something from nothing. They were building on an international infrastructure of scientific and legal racism, much of which originated in or was refined by the United States and Western Europe. And speaking of systems that were applied to entire populations before being applied to their most devastating extreme, let's talk about what happened before the death camps opened, when the killing was being conducted under the cover of medicine. Fact 14. The T4 euthanasia program killed 200,000 disabled people and trained the killers for what came next before the Holocaust began killing Jewish people systematically. The Nazi regime conducted a mass murder program targeting Germans with physical and mental disabilities. The program is known by its administrative address, Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, shortened to T4. And it was the direct training ground for the personnel and methods that would later be deployed in the Holocaust. The T4 program began in late 1939 with a secret authorization signed by Hitler. He backdated it to September 1st, 1939, the day the war began, to give it a veneer of wartime necessity. The authorization enabled doctors to grant a mercy death to patients considered incurably sick and useless. This designation was applied to people with conditions including schizophrenia, epilepsy, hereditary deafness, severe alcoholism, and physical disability. The process began with questionnaires sent to psychiatric hospitals and care institutions across Germany. Patients were evaluated based on forms, often never examined in person. 3 physicians, none of whom typically had seen the patient, would review the form and mark it with a plus or a minus. A plus was a death sentence. Panels of reviewers, working through stacks of forms like bureaucrats processing insurance claims, condemned tens of thousands of people to death. The patients were transported to one of 6 killing centers established across Germany and Austria. At these centers, they were killed in gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, the same technology that would later be used in the death camps. The bodies were cremated. Families received letters informing them that their relative had died of natural causes, often pneumonia, and that the body had been cremated for public health reasons. The letters were drafted in batches and sent with false dates and false causes of death. Approximately 200,000 people were killed in the T4 program between 1939 and 1941. The program was officially halted in August 1941, after Bishop Clemens August Graf von Galen gave a public sermon in Munster denouncing the killings. The sermon was distributed widely. Hitler ordered the program officially stopped, apparently concerned about public opinion. But the killing did not stop. It continued in a decentralized form called wild euthanasia, conducted in individual institutions, often through starvation and lethal medication, until the end of the war. An estimated 200,000 additional victims died in this decentralized phase. More critically for the Holocaust, the T4 program transferred its entire organizational apparatus, its personnel, its gassing technology, its cremation specialists, to the newly established Operation Reinhard death camps in occupied Poland in 1942. The men who built and operated Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were, many of them, T4 veterans. They brought with them the gas chambers, the organizational structure, and the bureaucratic habit of killing on an administrative schedule that had been refined in Germany. The Holocaust inherited its infrastructure from the T4 program. The weight of these histories is enormous. Let's settle. Let your body stay relaxed and heavy against the bed. You don't need to carry these stories. You only need to hear them and remember that they were real. And, speaking of operations that left almost no survivors and almost no trace, let's talk about the camp where the most people were killed and almost nothing was left standing afterward. Fact 15. Treblinka killed 900,000 people and was then plowed under and planted with crops. Treblinka. The name appears in Holocaust histories, but rarely receives the sustained attention it deserves compared to Auschwitz. And yet Treblinka was the single most lethal killing site in human history in terms of the number of people killed in the shortest period of time. Approximately 850,000 to 900,000 Jewish people were killed at Treblinka in just over a year of operation, between July 1942 and August 1943. The camp was established in a forest in northeastern Poland, 40 miles northeast of Warsaw. It was not a labor camp. There was no selection process. When the trains arrived, the people on them were told to undress and prepare for showers and disinfection before being resettled. They were given soap and a towel. They were led along a narrow path the SS called the Himmelfahrtstrasse, the road to heaven, screened by branches and fencing, so they could not see where they were going. At the end of the road were gas chambers, disguised as bathhouses. They were killed within minutes of arrival. The entire camp was organized around this single function. An arriving transport could be processed, every person killed, their belongings sorted, their bodies buried, and the platform cleared for the next train within hours. The camp operated like a machine, with the single product being death. At its peak, Treblinka was killing 10,000 people per day. The camp was run by a succession of SS commanders, most notably Franz Stangl, an Austrian who had worked in the T4 program. Stangl later escaped to Brazil, was extradited in 1967, tried in West Germany, and convicted of the murder of at minimum 400,000 people. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and died in prison in 1971, 6 months after sentencing. In an interview with journalist Gitta Serini before his death, he was asked if he felt guilt. He said, "My guilt is that I am still here." It was one of the very few honest statements he made. The Treblinka Revolt occurred on August 2, 1943. Prisoners who worked in the camp, mostly in the sorting of belongings and the maintenance of the camp, obtained weapons from the camp's armory by stealing a key. They shot guards, set fire to buildings, and approximately 600 to 800 prisoners managed to break through the perimeter fence and run. Most were caught and killed in the surrounding area. Approximately 40 to 70 survived the war. After the revolt, the camp was shut down, dismantled, and the ground was plowed and planted. When Vasily Grossman, the Soviet journalist, arrived in September 1943, he found almost nothing. His account of what he could reconstruct, published as The Hell of Treblinka, was among the first detailed accounts of the death camps to reach the wider world. The field where Treblinka stood is now a memorial. 17,000 stones, each representing a community destroyed in the Holocaust, stand in the earth where the camp once was. There is no physical trace of the camp itself. Only the stones, only the silence, and only the knowledge of what the silence covers. Fact 16. Denmark saved 99% of its Jewish population, proving that rescue was possible. In October 1943, the German occupation authorities in Denmark decided it was time to begin the deportation of Denmark's approximately 8,000 Jewish residents to the death camps. What happened next is unique in the history of the Holocaust, and it is important not just as a story of rescue, but as a demonstration that the passivity and complicity of other occupied populations was a choice, not an inevitability. George Ferdinand Duckwitz, a German naval attaché stationed in Copenhagen, learned of the deportation order. He warned Danish officials. Those officials, and then ordinary Danish citizens, organized a mass rescue operation with remarkable speed and coordination. Fishermen ferried Jewish families across the narrow strait to neutral Sweden in fishing boats, in kayaks, in any craft that could make the crossing. Churches and homes became hiding places. Ordinary Danes, many with no previous connection to the Jewish community, sheltered families, raised money to pay for the crossings, and kept the secret. Within 3 weeks, approximately 7,000 people had been brought to safety in Sweden. Of the 500 or so who were arrested during the operation, almost all were sent to their Seienstadt concentration camp in Czechoslovakia, which served partly as a showplace for Red Cross visitors rather than an extermination center. The Danish government and Danish citizens continue to advocate for those deported, sending food packages and pressuring the German authorities. Of the approximately 500 Jews deported from Denmark, approximately 50 died in the camps. The rest survived the war, many of them to return home to find their homes, businesses, and belongings intact, cared for by their neighbors in their absence. This is not a story that should make us feel comfortable. The Danish rescue was exceptional, not the norm. It occurred because of a specific combination of factors: a relatively humane German administration in Denmark, a strong tradition of social democracy and national solidarity, a short crossing to a genuinely neutral neighbor, and a population that did not have decades of state-sponsored anti-Semitism to overcome. Most occupied countries had none of these advantages. But the Danish rescue does tell us something important. Rescue was possible. It required courage and coordination and risk. But it was not impossible. In the countries where Jewish populations were almost entirely destroyed, the destruction happened because the surrounding populations chose passivity, or chose collaboration, or chose to look away. The Danes chose differently. And the difference between choosing and not choosing was 7,000 lives. And speaking of individuals who made unexpected choices, let's talk about a man whose early life would have made him the last person you'd expect to be remembered as a rescuer. Fact 17. Oskar Schindler was a Nazi Party member, womanizer, and black market profiteer before he became a rescuer. Most people know Oskar Schindler from Steven Spielberg's 1993 film Schindler's List. based on Thomas Keneally's 1982 novel Schindler's Arkansas. In both, Schindler is portrayed as a fundamentally decent man who is pushed, by witnessing atrocity, toward increasingly heroic action. This is not entirely wrong. But the full picture of who Schindler was before and during his years in Krakow is considerably more complicated. Schindler was born in 1908 in what is now the Czech Republic. He was a Nazi Party member, joining in 1939. He was recruited by the Abwehr, German military intelligence, as an informant before the war. When he arrived in Krakow in late 1939, immediately after the German occupation of Poland, he was a predatory opportunist who saw the dispossession of the Jewish population as a business opportunity. He took over a formerly Jewish-owned enamelware factory, using the forced removal of its Jewish owners as a means of acquiring it essentially without payment. He used Jewish forced labor from the Krakow ghetto because it was cheaper than paying Polish workers. He was also a flagrant womanizer, an enthusiastic drinker, and an energetic black market operator who bribed Nazi officials regularly. He was investigated multiple times for these activities. He was arrested 3 times on various charges and released each time, largely through his facility at bribing the right people and his charm with senior SS officers. What changed Schindler? The honest historical answer is that it happened gradually, and the full complexity of his motivations will probably never be completely understood. He witnessed the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto in March 1943, watching from horseback as SS men shot Jewish people in the streets. Something shifted. He began using his factory increasingly as a protective shield for his workers, arguing to SS officials that his Jewish workers were skilled and essential to the war effort. He spent his considerable personal fortune, much of it accumulated through wartime profiteering, on bribes to protect his workers, on food for them, on ensuring they were not deported to the death camps. By the end of the war, approximately 1,200 Jewish people had been saved because Oskar Schindler, a corrupt, charming, dishonest opportunist, decided to use those very qualities in service of something that was not dishonest or corrupt at all. He spent the rest of his life essentially penniless, his various post-war business ventures having failed. He was declared righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem in 1963. He died in 1974 and was buried in Jerusalem, at his own request. His grave is still visited by survivors and their descendants. The story of Schindler refuses the comfort of a simple moral. The man who saved 1,200 lives was no saint. He used the same skills, the same charm, the same willingness to bend rules that he had used in more selfish pursuits. Good and bad are rarely as neatly separated as we would like them to be. Fact 18. American eugenics directly inspired the Nazi racial hygiene program in the early decades of the 20th century. The United States was a world leader in the scientific movement known as eugenics, the theory that human populations could and should be improved through selective breeding and the prevention of reproduction by those deemed genetically inferior. American universities offered courses in eugenics. American philanthropists funded research. American states passed laws permitting forced sterilization of people deemed unfit. By 1935, 32 American states had such laws. Over 60,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized under these laws. Nazi racial theorists read American eugenics literature extensively and cited it approvingly. Madison Grant's 1916 book The Passing of the Great Race, which argued that Nordic races were superior and that their bloodlines were being diluted by immigration and interbreeding, was praised by Adolf Hitler in a letter to Grant. Hitler reportedly called it his Bible. The Carnegie Institution funded eugenics research in the United States that was cited in German academic literature. The Rockefeller Foundation provided grants to German eugenics institutions in the early 1930s. The architects of the Nazi racial hygiene program explicitly acknowledged American precedent. When the Nazis passed their law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring in 1933, which mandated forced sterilization for a range of conditions, it was directly modeled on model eugenics legislation drafted in the United States by Harry Laughlin of the Eugenics Record Office. Laughlin was so pleased by the adoption of his work by Germany that he accepted an honorary degree from the University of Heidelberg in 1936. This history is important for two reasons. First, it situates the Holocaust not as an eruption of uniquely German madness from nowhere, but as the extreme endpoint of ideological currents that were present and respected across the Western world. Second, it raises questions about accountability that go beyond Germany. The intellectual infrastructure of Nazi racial science was partially built in American universities, funded by American philanthropists, and developed by American scientists who faced no legal or professional consequences for their contribution to it. The last American state repealed its forced sterilization law in 2013. North Carolina. It offered financial compensation to living victims in 2014. That tells you something about how recently this history actually ended. And speaking of the corporations and institutions that enabled the machinery of the Holocaust, let's talk about one of the most direct examples of corporate complicity. Fact 19. IG Farben manufactured Zyklon B, owned slave labor factories at Auschwitz, and its executives served an average of 6 years in prison. IG Farben was the largest chemical and pharmaceutical corporation in the world in the 1930s. It was a conglomerate that included brands still household names today, including Bayer, BASF, and Hoechst. Its involvement in the Holocaust was direct, extensive, and represents one of the starkest examples of corporate complicity in genocide. IG Farben's subsidiary, Dagesh, manufactured Zyklon B, the pesticide that was adapted for use as the killing agent in the gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The company knew precisely what their product was being used for. The hydrogen cyanide pellets that became Zyklon B were specifically modified for the Auschwitz application, with the warning odorant removed so that victims would not detect the gas before it was too late. This modification was a deliberate design choice. More directly, IG Farben built an enormous synthetic rubber and gasoline plant at Auschwitz, known as IG Auschwitz or Bunemonowitz. This became the third component of the Auschwitz complex, after the main camp and Birkenau. IG Farben selected the Auschwitz site specifically because of the available slave labor supply. Prisoners from Auschwitz were worked to death building and operating the plant. IG Farben paid the SS a daily rate per prisoner, 4 Reichsmarks for an unskilled worker, 6 for a skilled one. When a prisoner was worked until they were too weak to work, they were returned to Auschwitz-Birkenau and gassed, and replaced with a new worker. The Bunemonowitz plant employed tens of thousands of prisoners over its operation. Primo Levi, whose memoir, If This Is a Man, is one of the most important literary accounts of the Holocaust, was a prisoner assigned to work at Bunemonowitz. He wrote about the camp with a detached, chemical precision appropriate to a man who was a chemist by training, describing the system by which the plant operated and the conditions in which the prisoners worked and died. After the war, 24 IG Farben directors were tried at Nuremberg in the IG Farben trial. 13 were convicted. The longest sentence handed down was 8 years. The average sentence was approximately 4 years. By the early 1950s, most had been released. Many returned to senior positions in West German industry. Karl Wurster, who had been managing director of BASF during the war, was cleared of wrongdoing and later became chairman of BASF Supervisory Board. IG Farben itself was broken up by the Allied occupation authorities. The successor companies, BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst, became major international corporations. In 1995, the successors established a foundation to compensate surviving forced laborers. The payments were made decades after most of the people who had been worked to death at Bunemonowitz had died. Let your eyes close for a moment. Let the weight of what you've heard settle into memory. These stories are heavy precisely because they are true, and in the darkness of your resting mind, let them sit alongside one another. The bureaucrat at 1C, the child on the selection platform, the IG Farben executive reviewing the ledger of daily prisoner deaths. Let them sit together in the dark. That is where history lives. And speaking of how the Holocaust was presented to the outside world while it was happening, let's talk about an extraordinary document that was smuggled out of Auschwitz and delivered to the Allies, who then did almost nothing. Fact 20. The Auschwitz Protocol told the world what was happening in 1944. The Allies chose not to bomb the rail lines. In April 1944, 2 Jewish prisoners managed to escape from Auschwitz-Birkenau. Their names were Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler. They had spent weeks preparing their escape, hiding in a hiding place beneath a woodpile within the camp perimeter, surviving on food they had stored, waiting for the perimeter searches to stop after an escape was reported. After 3 nights, they emerged and walked south toward Slovakia. Over the following days, they made their way to Slovakia and met with Jewish community leaders. They then did something remarkable. They dictated a 32-page report documenting everything they had observed and experienced at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The report described the physical layout of the camp, the gas chambers, the crematoria, the selection process, the number of people being killed, the methods being used, the national origins of the victims. It was the most detailed and accurate account of Auschwitz to reach the outside world while the camp was still operating. The Verba-Wetzler report, also known as the Auschwitz Protocol, was translated into multiple languages and forwarded to Jewish organizations, Allied governments, the Vatican, the International Red Cross, and the United States War Refugee Board. It reached President Roosevelt's desk. It reached Winston Churchill. It was published in newspapers in Switzerland, Britain, and the United States in June and July 1944. By June 1944, the deportation of Hungary's Jewish population to Auschwitz was well underway. Approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported between May 15 and July 9, 1944, the vast majority of them to Auschwitz, where most were killed immediately on arrival. The rail lines carrying these deportees ran through Auschwitz and connected to the main Hungarian rail network. Jewish organizations and some Allied officials repeatedly requested that the Allied air forces bomb the rail lines carrying Jews to Auschwitz or bomb the gas chambers themselves. The requests were refused. The reasons given included the assertion that resources should not be diverted from military targets, that the bombing would be technically difficult, and that the most effective way to stop the genocide was to win the war as quickly as possible. Historians have subsequently documented that Allied bombers were flying missions over the Auschwitz area in the summer of 1944 to bomb the IG Farben plant. The rail lines were not a technically impossible target. They were a political choice. The decision not to bomb the rail lines to Auschwitz while the Hungarian deportations were ongoing meant that approximately 400,000 people were killed in a period when the Allied leadership had been directly informed, with specific details, of exactly what was happening at the camp they were already bombing nearby. This is one of the most contested and painful questions in Holocaust history. It is also one of the most clearly documented cases of informed inaction. Fact 21. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was the largest Jewish armed resistance of the Holocaust, April 19, 1943. Warsaw. The Passover Seder has begun in what remains of the Warsaw Ghetto when German SS troops and police enter the ghetto to complete its liquidation. They expect to encounter a demoralized, weakened population. They are met instead with gunfire. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising had been planned for months by the Żydowska Organizacja, the Jewish Combat Organization, known by its Polish initials, ZOB, and the Żydowski Związek Wojskowy, the Jewish Military Union, known as ZZW. The fighters numbered approximately 500 to 500 people armed with a small number of pistols, a few rifles, some homemade Molotov cocktails, and smuggled explosive devices. They faced SS troops, regular German police, and armored vehicles. What followed was not, in military terms, a victory. The fighters knew it would not be a military victory. Mordecai Anielewicz, the 23-year-old commander of the ZOB, and those around him understood that their aim was not to win, but to resist, to die as fighters rather than as victims, to demonstrate that Jewish people had not gone passively to their deaths, as some post-war accounts shamefully implied. The initial German assault on April 19th was repulsed. SS troops were driven back by the fighters using the buildings and sewers of the ghetto for cover. The Germans, shocked by the resistance, escalated. SS Brigadeführer Jürgen Stroop, the commander of the operation, began systematically burning the ghetto building by building, using flamethrowers and demolition charges to drive the fighters from their positions. The uprising lasted 27 days. The final fighters died or were captured in May 1943. Anil Wicks died in his command bunker at 18 Mila Street on May 8th, either from the gas the Germans pumped into the bunker or by his own hand. Stroop submitted a report to his superiors, including photographs, bound in leather, with the title, "The Jewish Quarter of Warsaw is No More." He was tried and executed in 1952. Some fighters escaped through the sewers and continued fighting with Polish partisan groups outside the ghetto. A handful survived the war. The historian Yisrael Gutman, himself a survivor of the uprising, wrote extensively about it. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising became a foundational narrative of Jewish resistance, inspiring subsequent generations and challenging the post-war narrative that Jewish people had been passive in the face of their destruction. They had not been passive. They had been systematically disarmed, deceived, starved, and isolated. And still, when the moment came, some of them fought, with almost nothing, against everything. Fact 22. The Sonderkommando revolt at Auschwitz was planned in secret and nearly succeeded October 7, 1944. Auschwitz-Birkenau. The Sonderkommando, the prisoner units forced to work in the crematoria, have known for months that the SS intends to kill them. This is the standard procedure. Sonderkommando units are periodically liquidated and replaced with new arrivals to maintain secrecy about the camp's operations. The Sonderkommando also know that the Soviet army is advancing and that the camp may be evacuated or destroyed. They have been planning. The revolt had been in preparation for months, coordinated with the ZOB, the Jewish combat organization that had fought in the Warsaw Ghetto. The plan was to blow up all 4 crematoria simultaneously using explosives smuggled into the camp by Jewish women workers of the nearby Union Munitions factory. The women, Rosa Robota, Ella Gartner, Estera Wajblom, and Regina Safferstage, have been extracting tiny amounts of explosive powder from their workstation for months, hiding it in the hems of their dresses, in food containers, and passing it to the Sonderkommando through intermediaries. On October 7, 1944, the revolt was triggered prematurely. A rumor spread that Crematorium IV Sonderkommando was about to be selected for liquidation that day. They rose up immediately, using their explosive powder, homemade grenades, and tools. They set Crematorium 4 on fire. The explosion was visible across the camp. Sonderkommando at Crematorium 2 also rose up, cutting the barbed wire fence and attempting to escape to the nearby forest. 3 SS guards were killed. 1 was thrown alive into the burning furnace. The revolt was suppressed within hours. The SS deployed overwhelming force. 250 Sonderkommando were killed in the fighting or executed immediately afterward. Of the 60 or so who escaped the camp, all were recaptured and killed within days. The 4 women who had smuggled the explosives were arrested, tortured, and interrogated. They revealed nothing about their networks under torture. They were publicly hanged in January 1945 as the camp was being evacuated in front of the assembled remaining women prisoners. Rosa Robota's last message, smuggled to a fellow prisoner before her execution, read in Hebrew, Chazak v'amatz. Be strong and courageous. The revolt destroyed Crematorium 4 permanently. It was never repaired. At the moment the revolt was suppressed, the Sonderkommando death toll in the crematoria was reduced by the destruction of one of the 4 facilities. These are the details that textbooks rarely reach. The 4 women, the hems of the dresses, the message in Hebrew, the name Rosa Robota. Remember it. Let your body rest deeply now. Let your breath slow. The history you are hearing does not require you to carry it consciously. It only requires you to let it in. Fact 23. The Kindertransport saved 10,000 children. Their parents were left behind. Between December 1938 and September 1939, approximately 10,000 Jewish children were sent from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, in Poland to Great Britain on a rescue operation organized by Jewish and Quaker relief organizations, with the agreement of the British government. The children ranged in age from infants to teenagers. They traveled by train to ports in Germany and the Netherlands, crossed the English Channel by ship, and were received in Britain by host families, Jewish communities, and refugee organizations. The operation was called the Kindertransport. The transport children. The parents who put their children on those trains made an almost incomprehensible choice. They chose to send their children away to strangers in a foreign country, knowing they might never see them again, because they had calculated that the danger their children faced if they remained was greater than the pain of separation. In many cases, they were right. Of the children who traveled on the Kindertransport, the vast majority survived the war. Of the parents who remained behind, most did not. A child named Nicholas Winton, who was a British stockbroker, organized a rescue of 669 Czech Jewish children specifically, working in Prague in 1938 and 1939, arranging visas, transportation, and host families in Britain. He never spoke publicly about what he had done. In 1988, on the British television program That's Life, he was sitting in the audience when the host produced his scrapbook of the rescue operation and asked if anyone in the audience had been saved by Nicholas Winton. Nearly the entire audience stood up. These were the children he had saved, now in their 60s and 70s, sitting around the man who had saved them, whom most of them had never met. For the children of the Kindertransport, the rescue was also a rupture. Many were separated from their siblings. Many never saw their parents again. Many arrived speaking no English, placed with families they did not know, in a country they did not know, without the context to understand why they had been sent away. Some were treated well. Some were treated as domestic servants. Some were placed in institutions. The children of the Kindertransport grew up carrying the specific grief of the saved, which is not the same as happiness, and includes the guilt of the survivor. Most of the parents who watched their children board those trains were killed in the Holocaust. Fact 24. The Mississippi St. Louis carried 937 Jewish refugees to Cuba, was turned away, and most of its passengers were eventually killed May 13, 1939. The Mississippi St. Louis, a German ocean liner operated by the Hamburg America Line, departs Hamburg for Havana, Cuba. On board are 937 passengers, almost all of them Jewish refugees from Germany, fleeing Nazi persecution. They have paid for valid Cuban landing certificates. They are heading towards safety. By the time they arrive in Cuban waters, the political situation in Cuba has changed. The Cuban president has been pressured to reject the landing certificates, which he deemed improperly issued. Cuba denies entry to most of the passengers. The ship sits in Havana harbor for days while negotiations take place. Passengers can see the lights of Havana from the deck. Some attempt suicide. American Jewish organizations and the U.S. government are contacted for help. The ship turns toward Florida. The U.S. Coast Guard shadows the St. Louis to prevent passengers from jumping overboard and swimming to shore, because American law prohibits unauthorized immigration. Captain Gustav Schroeder navigates as slowly as possible, stalling for time, desperately hoping for a diplomatic resolution. Franklin Roosevelt receives a personal appeal. He does not respond. Secretary of State Cordell Hull advises that the passengers must await their turn on the immigration quota, a bureaucratic process that would take years. The United States has a quota system for immigrants from Germany, and the refugees on the St. Louis are not at the front of any queue. The St. Louis turns back toward Europe. For European countries, Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands agree to accept the passengers. This appears to be a resolution. 288 passengers go to the United Kingdom. The rest go to France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. When Germany conquered France, Belgium, and the Netherlands in 1940, the Jewish passengers who had disembarked in those countries found themselves under German occupation. Of the 907 passengers who were turned away from Cuba and the United States, scholars at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum have traced 254 who were killed in the Holocaust. They died in Auschwitz, Sobibor, Bergen-Belsen, and Terezin. Most of them had been within sight of the Florida coastline in May 1939. The decision not to admit the refugees was not a failure of knowledge. American officials knew what was happening in Germany. The decision was a combination of economic anxiety during the Great Depression, nativist sentiment about immigration, and bureaucratic rigidity. And its consequences were measured in 254 lives. Fact 25. The Lebensborn program was an SS scheme to breed a master race, and its children were abandoned by history. In 1935, Heinrich Himmler established a program called Lebensborn, which translates as Fount of Life or Spring of Life. Its stated purpose was to support the birth rate of racially pure German children and to provide support for the mothers of those children, including unmarried women who might otherwise seek abortions. Its actual function was considerably darker in scope. The Lebensborn homes were established across Germany and later across occupied Europe, particularly in Norway, where the Norwegian women who had relationships with German soldiers gave birth to an estimated 10,000 to 12,000 children. Lebensborn homes provided medical care, safe delivery, and documentation of the child's racial credentials. They were part of Himmler's obsession with racial purity and his ambition to significantly increase the German birth rate through the production of racially approved children. In occupied countries, particularly in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Norway, the Lebensborn program went further. Children who appear to meet the Nazi criteria for racial desirability, who were blonde, blue-eyed, and had the physical characteristics the Nazis associated with Nordic heritage, were taken from their families forcibly. They were given German names, placed with German families or in Lebensborn homes, and raised as German children with no memory of their origins. Their families were sometimes told the children had died. Sometimes they were simply taken without explanation. Estimates of the number of children stolen for the Lebensborn program range from 50,000 to 200,000 across occupied Europe. After the war, the fate of the Lebensborn children was complex and painful. Children in Norway who were born to German fathers and Norwegian mothers were stigmatized as collaborators' children. Some were institutionalized. Some were sent to Germany. Some were subjected to abuse. ABBA's Anni-Frid Lyngstad, who achieved international fame as one of the lead singers of the Swedish pop group ABBA, was a Lebensborn child, the daughter of a Norwegian woman and a German sergeant. She did not know her father until 1977. Children who had been kidnapped and raised as Germans in Germany sometimes discovered their true origins after the war. Some were reunited with their biological families. Some were too young to remember or speak the language of their birth country. Some were never identified. To this day, organizations in Poland and other countries are working to identify surviving stolen Lebensborn children, some of whom are now in their 70s and 80s, through DNA testing. The Nuremberg trials classified the kidnapping of children as a war crime. SS General Gregor Ebner, who ran the Lebensborn program, was tried and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. He served 1 year. He was released in 1949 and lived quietly until his death in 1974. And with that, we have reached the midpoint of our journey tonight. 25 facts from a history that is still being excavated, still being understood, still demanding to be heard. Your breathing is slow, and even now, the darkness is comfortable. And there are 25 more truths waiting to emerge from it. This is the end of part 1. Part 2 continues the journey. Sleep gently until then. Fact 26. Zyklon B was originally a pesticide, and the man who created its chemical ancestor won a Nobel Prize. Fritz Haber was one of the most brilliant chemists of the 20th century. In 1909, he developed the Haber-Bosch process, a method for synthesizing ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen, which made it possible to produce artificial fertilizers on an industrial scale. This discovery is estimated to have enabled the feeding of approximately half of the world's current population by dramatically increasing agricultural yields. For this, Fritz Haber received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1918. Fritz Haber was also the father of chemical warfare. During World War I, he oversaw the development and deployment of chlorine gas and other chemical weapons against Allied troops. His wife, Clara, also a chemist, was so horrified by this work that she shot herself with his service pistol after he returned from personally supervising the first major chlorine gas attack at Ypres in April 1915. He attended a dinner in his honor that night and left the next morning to supervise a gas attack on the Eastern Front. After World War I, Haber's institute at the Kaiser Wilhelm Society developed a cyanide-based pesticide called Zyklon, later modified into Zyklon B, designed initially for use in fumigating grain stores and killing lice in buildings. In 1920, it was used in California to fumigate buildings along the U.S.-Mexican border, including to disinfect Mexican immigrants entering the United States. Fritz Haber was Jewish. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, he was forced out of his position as director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry, despite being one of Germany's most celebrated scientists. He died in exile in 1934, before the Holocaust began. He never knew that Zyklon B, derived from the chemical family his institute helped develop, would be used to murder approximately 1 million people, including many of his own relatives, in the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The Zyklon B used at Auschwitz was manufactured by Digesh and Testa, two companies with connections to IG Farben. It came in the form of small blue pellets. When exposed to air, the pellets released hydrogen cyanide gas, which binds to the enzymes in cells and prevents them from using oxygen, causing death by internal suffocation. The pellets were dropped through holes in the roof of the gas chambers by SS men wearing gas masks. Death typically occurred within 15 to 20 minutes, though this varied depending on the concentration in the chamber and the number of people inside. The company that held the patent on Zyklon B was paid a licensing fee for each canister used. The fee was calculated per unit. There were invoices. And speaking of the physical infrastructure of murder, let's talk about the only camp in the Holocaust that tattooed its prisoners and what those tattoos meant. Fact 27. Only Auschwitz tattooed its prisoners. And the reason tells you everything about the camp's function. If you have ever seen a photograph of a Holocaust survivor with a number tattooed on their forearm, that survivor was at Auschwitz or one of its subcamps. The practice of tattooing prisoners was unique to the Auschwitz complex among the German concentration and death camps. And the reason it was introduced there, and not elsewhere, reveals something specific about the camp's dual function as both a death camp and a slave labor facility. In most of the Operation Reinhard death camps, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, there was no need to identify prisoners by number because almost no one was expected to survive long enough to require identification. People arrived, were killed, and their personal documents were destroyed or confiscated. The camps had no need for prisoner records because the prisoners had no future in the camp's administration. Auschwitz was different. Auschwitz was simultaneously a death camp, where the majority of arrivals were killed immediately, and a labor camp, where a selected minority of arrivals were used for forced labor in the camp complex and in the surrounding industrial facilities, including IG Farben's Buna plant. The selected prisoners were expected to survive for weeks or months, working until they were too exhausted to continue, at which point they too would be killed and replaced. This created an administrative need to track individuals. The tattooing practice began in 1941, initially with Soviet prisoners of war. Jewish prisoners began being tattooed in 1942. The tattoo was applied to the left forearm, using a special single needle device or a metal stamp with multiple needles. The ink was rubbed into the punctures. The numbers were assigned sequentially. By the time the camp was liberated in January 1945, approximately 400,000 people had been tattooed at Auschwitz. The psychological dimension of the tattooing was understood by the SS and was part of the systematic dehumanization of prisoners. In Jewish religious tradition, tattooing is prohibited. Applying a permanent identification number to a human being as if to property was an act of deliberate cultural violation as well as administrative control. Many survivors who lived long lives after the war had complicated relationships with their tattoos. Some had them removed. Some kept them always visible. Some covered them. Some showed them to their grandchildren as a testimony. The most famous tattooed prisoner may be Elie Wiesel, the writer and Nobel Peace Prize winner who survived Auschwitz and Buchenwald and whose memoir Night remains one of the essential texts of Holocaust literature. He bore the number A. 7713. He testified about the Holocaust before the United States Congress and at commemorative events across the world until his death in 2016. He was 87 years old. He had spent 70 years carrying that number and what it represented through every day of his life. And speaking of what was taken from the victims, both before and after their deaths, let's talk about the systematic theft that was built into the Holocaust at every level. Fact 28. The Nazis harvested hair, gold teeth, and the ashes of the dead for industrial use. The Holocaust was not only an act of ideological murder. It was also a system of theft on a scale that had no precedent in history. From the moment Jewish families were forced to register their assets under Nazi law in 1938, through the confiscation of businesses and property, the liquidation of bank accounts, the stripping of valuables upon arrival at the camps, and the extraction of gold from the teeth of the dead, the Nazi state was engaged in one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history. At the death camps and at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the theft was conducted with the same bureaucratic efficiency as the killing. Prisoners arriving at the selection platform were told to leave their luggage, which would be brought to them later. The luggage was taken to the area of the camp the prisoners called Kaneda, a name that carried connotations of abundance. These warehouses were filled with the belongings of hundreds of thousands of murdered people. Clothing was sorted and sent back to Germany for redistribution. Valuables were cataloged. Money was collected. Food was taken. The hair was cut from women's bodies after death in the gas chambers. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, this hair was packed into bales and shipped to a German firm called Alex Zink, which used it to manufacture industrial felt and cloth. When Soviet investigators liberated Auschwitz in January 1945, they found in the warehouses approximately 7 tons of human hair, already baled and ready for shipment. The hair belonged to approximately 40,000 people. Hair analysts later confirmed it was human hair, much of it dyed, still bearing traces of Zyklon B. The gold teeth were extracted from the mouths of the dead by the Sonderkommando and melted down. This gold was sent to the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, where it was processed alongside gold looted from occupied countries, central bank reserves, and jewelry taken from Jewish families across Europe. Operation Reinhard, the code name for the killing program in the general government of occupied Poland, was also the code name for the associated financial operation. The economic proceeds of the murder of approximately 2 million people in the Operation Reinhard camps were tracked separately from general war finance. The gold, currency, and valuables had their own accounting. The total value of assets stolen from Jewish victims of the Holocaust has been estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars in modern values. Most of it was never returned. The families of those murdered received nothing. The gold that passed through the Reichsbank was distributed to various European financial institutions after the war. Some of it ended up in the Swiss banking system, which accepted looted gold throughout the war and maintained its neutrality by serving both sides. The Swiss banking scandal of the 1990s, in which it emerged that Swiss banks were holding accounts belonging to Holocaust victims whose heirs had never been able to claim them, resulted in settlements and reparations. But the settlements were a fraction of what had been taken. And speaking of institutions that were deeply complicit in the Holocaust and faced minimal consequences, let's talk about the body that was meant to protect the world's most vulnerable people and failed catastrophically. Fact 29. The International Red Cross visited their science dad, was deceived, and issued a favorable report. The International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, has a mandate to monitor the treatment of prisoners of war and civilians in wartime. During the Second World War, the ICRC was permitted by the German government to inspect some concentration camps. And the ICRC's handling of this responsibility during the Holocaust is one of the most complex and troubling chapters in the organization's history. Their science dad, known in Czech as Terezin, was a garrison town in Czechoslovakia that the Nazis converted into a concentration camp and transit ghetto in late 1941. It served multiple functions. It was used to hold elderly, prominent, or decorated German and Austrian Jews, whose disappearance might attract international attention. It was used as a transit point for deportations to Auschwitz. And, crucially, it was used as a showplace for external audiences. In 1944, as international pressure and rumors about the extermination camps grew, the German authorities permitted the Red Cross to visit their Scienstadt. The Nazis had spent months preparing the camp for the visit. A beautification program was implemented. Buildings were painted, gardens were planted, a cafe, a music pavilion, and recreational facilities were created. Streets were renamed. Children were coached to appear healthy and happy. Prisoners were moved to reduce overcrowding. A film was made, which was used as Nazi propaganda. The Red Cross delegation visited in June 1944 and issued a report that described their Scienstadt in terms that did not reflect the reality of the camp or acknowledge the mass deportations to Auschwitz that had been and were still occurring. The delegation appears to have been genuinely deceived by the elaborate staging, though subsequent analysis has questioned how much critical examination was actually applied. The ICRC during the Second World War also had access to substantial information about the extermination camps through various channels. An internal Red Cross memorandum from late 1942 demonstrates that the organization's leadership knew the broad outlines of what was happening to Jewish people in occupied Europe. A proposal to publicly condemn the extermination was discussed internally and rejected, largely on the grounds that a public condemnation might result in the loss of access to regular prisoners of war. The organization chose institutional self-preservation over public moral condemnation of genocide. After the war, the ICRC commissioned historical studies examining its conduct and has acknowledged the failures of its wartime response. The acknowledgement, though honest, could not change what had not been said or done when it might have mattered. Your breathing is deep and regular now. The weight of what you've heard presses softly on your chest, like a book left open on the page where you stopped reading. Let rest there, and let your mind drift with the next fact, which concerns the only country that systematically saved almost all of its Jewish population through an act of collective moral courage. We told you about Denmark in part 1. Now let's talk about another country with a very different story, and then the country that had perhaps the most complex relationship of all with Jewish rescue and Jewish murder. Fact 30. Poland both sheltered Jews and murdered them, and this complexity has never been fully resolved. Poland occupies a uniquely painful and complex position in Holocaust history. More Jewish people were murdered in Poland than in any other country. Approximately 3 million of Poland's 3.5 million Jewish residents were killed in the Holocaust, approximately 90% of the pre-war Jewish population. This occurred because Germany established its major death camps on Polish soil, because Polish Jews made up the largest single national group of Holocaust victims, and because the German occupation of Poland was among the most brutal in Europe. At the same time, Poland has more individuals recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, the Israeli Holocaust Memorial Authority, than any other country. More than 7,000 Polish individuals and families have received this recognition for risking their lives to shelter or rescue Jewish people during the German occupation. The Zgoda Network, the Polish Council to Aid Jews, was the only government-in-exile-sponsored organization in occupied Europe specifically dedicated to rescuing Jewish people, providing false documents, financial support, and hiding places to approximately 50,000 people. But the full picture is darker still. Alongside the rescuers and the resistors, there were Poles who participated in the persecution and murder of Jewish people. The pogrom at Jedwabne in July 1941, in which Polish residents of the town, not German soldiers, killed their Jewish neighbors, estimated at 340 people, is the most documented example of Polish participation in the killing. Jan Gross's 2001 book Neighbors, which documented the Jedwabne massacre, caused a national crisis in Poland. The Polish government eventually acknowledged that Poles had committed the killings and issued an official apology. But the political debate around Polish complicity versus Polish heroism has never been fully resolved and has in recent years become increasingly contentious. Polish legislation passed in 2018 initially made it a criminal offense to attribute responsibility for Holocaust crimes to the Polish nation or state. The law was internationally condemned and partially amended, but the underlying political tension between acknowledging Polish complicity and defending Polish honor in the Holocaust has not diminished. The historian Jan Tomasz Gross, who also wrote about anti-Jewish violence in post-war Poland, has argued that the true relationship between Poles and the Holocaust is more complex than either the heroic rescuer narrative or the collaborator narrative can capture. There were extraordinary rescuers. There were perpetrators. There was a large middle, the people who watched, who did not help, who sometimes profited from the disappearance of their Jewish neighbors, and who never asked too many questions. The middle is perhaps the most important and most uncomfortable part of the story. And speaking of the institutional structures that were meant to document crimes, but were compromised by politics, let's talk about the most famous trial in history and what it failed to achieve. Fact 31. The Nuremberg trials convicted only 24 people for the deaths of millions when the International Military Tribunal convened at Nuremberg in November 1945 to try the major Nazi war criminals. It was a landmark moment in the history of international law. For the first time in history, political and military leaders were being held accountable by an international court for crimes against humanity. The principles established at Nuremberg, that individuals could be held criminally responsible for state-directed genocide and that superior orders was not an adequate defense, have formed the basis of international criminal law ever since. But 24 men stood in the dock at the International Military Tribunal for what the prosecution described as a criminal conspiracy that had resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people. Of the 24, 12 received death sentences. 3 received life sentences. 4 received sentences of 10 to 20 years. 3 were acquitted. 1 committed suicide before the trial concluded. The Nuremberg trials, in their various phases, encompassed more than just the main trial. The subsequent Nuremberg trials, conducted by the Allied Control Council, included 12 additional trials between 1946 and 1949, prosecuting doctors, judges, military officers, SS commanders, and industrialists. These resulted in approximately 185 additional convictions, from a pool of perpetrators numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The vast majority of those who participated in the Holocaust faced no legal accountability at all. The doctors who performed experiments on prisoners, the engineers who built the crematoria, the railway officials who scheduled the deportation trains, the civil servants who processed the deportation orders, the policemen who guarded the ghettos, the informants who identified Jewish families in hiding, the camp guards who beat and shot prisoners. Most of them went home. Most of them lived normal lives. In West Germany, the denazification process that was supposed to cleanse German society of Nazi perpetrators was largely ineffective. German courts were staffed by judges who had served under the Nazi regime. Prosecutors brought few cases. Juries were reluctant to convict. Statutes of limitations were applied to crimes that should have had no limitation. The German prosecutor Fritz Bauer, who was Jewish and had survived the war in exile, almost single-handedly drove the prosecution of Nazi criminals through West German courts in the 1950s and 1960s, including securing the intelligence that led to the capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina. Bauer was isolated, harassed, and surveilled by the very state apparatus he was trying to reform. He died in 1968 under circumstances that were officially ruled accidental and have been disputed ever since. The Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961 was the most significant Nazi war crimes prosecution after Nuremberg. Eichmann, the administrator of the final solution, the man who organized the deportation logistics, was tried before an Israeli court, convicted, and executed in 1962. He was the only person ever executed by the State of Israel. And speaking of what happened to the perpetrators who were never caught, let's talk about the networks that helped them escape. Fact 32. The Vatican and Catholic organizations helped Nazi war criminals escape to South America after the war. Thousands of Nazi war criminals escaped from Europe to South America and other destinations through networks that have been documented by historians and investigators. These networks, known collectively as the Ratlins, were operated through a combination of former SS networks, sympathetic Catholic clergy, and neutral or complicit governments. And the involvement of Catholic Church institutions in at least parts of these escape networks is documented and undeniable. Bishop Alois Hudel, an Austrian prelate based in Rome, was one of the most active facilitators of Nazi escapes. He operated openly from Rome, providing false papers, letters of reference, and connections to institutions in South America to former SS officers and war criminals. He helped, among others, Franz Stangl, the commandant of Treblinka, and Gustav Wagner, the deputy commandant of Sobibor. His activities were known to his superiors in the Vatican. The International Committee of the Red Cross, as well as various Catholic charities and institutions, provided humanitarian travel documents and papers to people fleeing post-war Europe. These documents were intended for genuine refugees. They were also used by war criminals who had obtained false identities. The ICRC has subsequently acknowledged that its document issuance procedures were exploited by people whose true identities were concealed. Argentina under Juan Perón was the primary destination for many fleeing Nazis, including Eichmann, Mengele, Erich Priebke, who had helped organize the massacre of 335 Italian civilians in the Ardeatine caves in Rome in 1944, and Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief and lion known as the Butcher of Lyon, who had tortured and deported thousands of French Jews before escaping, with assistance from American intelligence, to Bolivia. Simon Wiesenthal, who survived multiple camps including Auschwitz and Mauthausen, spent the rest of his life tracking Nazi war criminals. He helped locate dozens of perpetrators, including Eichmann and Franz Stangl. His work was often opposed by European governments who preferred that the cases stay closed. He faced death threats, had a bomb placed at his home, and was accused by some critics of exaggerating his role in finding Eichmann. He died in 2005 at age 96, having outlived most of the people he was hunting. And speaking of what knowledge was available to the world about the Holocaust while it was happening, let's talk about one of the most disturbing examples of willful ignorance. Fact 33. The New York Times buried Holocaust news on its back pages throughout the war. The New York Times is generally regarded as one of the world's newspapers of record. During the Second World War, it was the most influential newspaper in the United States. And throughout the years of the Holocaust, stories about the systematic murder of Jewish people in Europe were routinely buried in the paper's back pages, given minimal space, framed with hedging language, and treated as less important than the military campaign reporting that dominated the front pages. Historian Laurel Leff documented this extensively in her 2005 book Buried by the Times. She analyzed every story the Times published between 1939 and 1945 that related to the persecution and murder of Jewish people in Europe. She found that of approximately 1,000 such stories, only 24 appeared on the front page. Most were relegated to pages 10, 12, or beyond. The Times consistently underplayed the scale of the killings, used cautious and distancing language, and failed to draw together the individual reports into a coherent narrative of genocide. The Times' publisher during this period was Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, who was Jewish. This is not incidental. Sulzberger was deeply concerned about accusations of bias in coverage of issues affecting Jewish people, and his concern led him in the opposite direction, to underemphasize and downplay rather than risk accusations of special pleading. The paper also reflected the editorial culture of American journalism more broadly, which was cautious about giving prominence to stories that seemed extraordinary, that came from sources that could not be independently verified, and that implicated the full breadth of a nation in systematic atrocity. This is not to say the Times ignored the Holocaust entirely. It published many important stories. But the aggregate effect of the editorial choices made across 6 years was to present the murder of 6 million people as a secondary story, something happening at the margins of a larger conflict, rather than as the central catastrophe of the 20th century. The American government's own response was shaped partly by public awareness. If the major newspapers were treating the genocide as back-page news, public pressure for a stronger response was harder to build. The story was there. It was documented. It was available. The choices about how much space to give it and where to place it were editorial choices that had consequences. And speaking of powerful institutions that had access to information and chose not to act on it, let's talk about one of the most painful examples of all. Fact 34. Pope Pius XII knew about the extermination of Jews and did not publicly condemn. The question of what Pope Pius XII knew about the Holocaust and what he chose to do with that knowledge has been debated by historians, theologians, and policymakers for more than 70 years. The debate is not about whether he knew. It is about why he chose not to speak more directly and whether a papal condemnation would have made a difference. Pius XII had access to detailed information about the Holocaust through multiple channels. Catholic priests and bishops across occupied Europe wrote to the Vatican with reports of what was happening to Jewish communities in their areas. The Vatican's own diplomatic networks provided intelligence from occupied countries. Polish bishops sent detailed accounts of the killing of Jewish people in Poland to Rome from 1942 onward. The American diplomat Myron Taylor carried information directly to the Pope from the United States government. By late 1942, Pius XII had substantial knowledge of the systematic murder of Jewish people across Europe. In December 1942, Pius XII gave his Christmas radio address to the world. In it, he referred obliquely to the hundreds of thousands of people who, through no fault of their own, by reason of their nationality or race, were destined for death. He did not name Jewish people. He did not name the perpetrators. He did not call for the killing to stop. The diplomatic language was calibrated not to break relations with Germany or to expose Catholics in occupied countries to retaliation. The Pope's defenders argue that a more explicit condemnation would have made conditions worse for Jews and for Catholics in occupied Europe, and point to specific cases, notably in Rome, where intervention may have saved lives. Critics, including the historian John Cornwell, whose 1999 book Hitler's Pope was highly controversial, argue that the institutional priorities of the Vatican, including anti-communism, protection of church property, and fear of Nazi retaliation, outweighed moral imperatives. The question of whether a clear and unambiguous papal condemnation of the extermination of the Jewish people would have changed anything is ultimately unanswerable. What is answerable is that the voice that carried perhaps the greatest moral authority in the world in 1942, the voice to which hundreds of millions of Catholics across Europe listened, chose not to use that authority to name what was happening. The Vatican opened part of its wartime archive for scholarly review in 2020. The documents are still being examined. The debate continues. Let your body sink deeper into rest now. You've been listening for a long time, and the weight of these histories deserves to be held in stillness. Stay with the quiet for a moment. Then let's continue. Fact 35. Operation Reinhard was the most lethal phase of the Holocaust and is among the least known. Most people, when they think of the Holocaust, think of Auschwitz. Auschwitz is the most famous, the most documented, and the most extensively memorialized of the Nazi camps. But Auschwitz was not where the largest number of people were killed. The most lethal phase of the Holocaust was Operation Reinhard, a program so destructive and so deliberately erased from the physical record that it remains less well understood than it deserves. Operation Reinhard was the code name for the Nazi plan to murder the approximately 2 million Jewish people living in the German-administered area of occupied Poland, known as the General Government. It was named after Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the final solution, who was assassinated in Prague in June 1942 by Czech and Slovak parachutists trained by the British. 3 dedicated extermination camps were built for the operation: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. A 4th facility at Majdanek also participated. These camps were not concentration camps in the sense that prisoners were held there for extended periods. They were killing factories. The vast majority of people who arrived at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were dead within hours. There were no selections for labor. There were no prisoner barracks for the incoming transports. There was only the undressing area, the path to the gas chambers, and the pits or the pyres. Belzec operated between March and December 1942 and killed approximately 430,000 to 500,000 people. It had 2 SS officers and a small number of Ukrainian auxiliary guards. There were 2 known Jewish survivors of Belzec. 2. The rest of the people who entered the camp were killed. Sobibor operated from May 1942 to October 1943 and killed approximately 170,000 to 250,000 people. A prisoner revolt on October 14, 1943, organized by Soviet Jewish prisoner Leon Feldhendler and Red Army officer Alexander Petrovsky, resulted in the escape of approximately 300 people. Of these, approximately 40 to 60 survived the war. The camp was subsequently demolished. Treblinka, as discussed in Part 1, killed approximately 900,000 people. The total death toll of Operation Reinhard is estimated at approximately 1.7 to 2 million people, killed between March 1942 and November 1943. This represents approximately 1/3 of the total Jewish death toll of the Holocaust, concentrated in 20 months at 3 camps in northeastern Poland, all of which were deliberately destroyed at the end of operation. The men who ran these camps were primarily for veterans. Most of them survived the war. And speaking of the perpetrators who built and ran the killing apparatus, let's talk about what happened to them specifically. Fact 36. Most Holocaust perpetrators lived normal lives after the war. Franz Stangl commanded Treblinka. He oversaw the murder of approximately 900,000 people. After the war, he fled to Brazil with the help of Bishop Heudel's escape network, worked as a foreman at a Volkswagen factory in Sao Paulo for 15 years, and was living under his own name when Simon Wiesenthal finally located him in 1967. He was extradited to West Germany, tried, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1971, 6 months after sentencing. Franz Hostler commanded the women's section of Auschwitz-Birkenau and was later transferred to Bergen-Belsen. He was captured, tried at the Bergen-Belsen trial, and hanged in 1945. His case was one of the relatively rare ones that resulted in execution. Odilo Globoknik organized and oversaw the construction and operation of the Operation Reinhard camps. He killed himself in May 1945 when captured by British forces. But these are the exceptions. The commanders who faced justice were a minority of a minority. The vast majority of the thousands of men and women who operated the camps, guarded the ghetto walls, drove the deportation trains, processed the paperwork, sorted the belongings, and served in the Einsatzgruppen went home after the war, resumed civilian life, and in most cases were never prosecuted. The estimate of individuals directly implicated in the Holocaust as perpetrators or direct accomplices ranges from 100,000 to 500,000 people. Approximately 25,000 individuals were convicted of Holocaust-related crimes across all post-war proceedings. Most received sentences of a few years. In West Germany, the 1969 statute of limitations debate is instructive. Murder in West Germany had a 20-year statute of limitations, meaning that by 1965, it was technically possible for Nazi war crimes committed in 1945 to become statute barred. The Bundestag voted in 1965 to extend the limitation. It voted in 1969 to extend it again. It was not until 1979 that the Bundestag voted to eliminate the statute of limitations for murder entirely, largely to allow continued prosecution of Nazi war criminals. By 1979, most of the people who had committed the crimes had been living quietly for over 30 years. Their children had grown up. Some had grandchildren. Many had rebuilt entirely normal lives, and the communities they lived in either did not know what they had done or had chosen not to ask. The social rehabilitation of perpetrators was remarkably swift and remarkably complete. One of the most chilling documents in this history is a statistical analysis by historian Robert Gelately, who examined how many of the men who participated in the Einsatzgruppen killing operations were prosecuted. The answer: a very small fraction. And speaking of the specific individuals who built the administrative apparatus of the Holocaust, let's talk about the man who organized the deportation logistics for millions of people and spent his post-war years in Argentina gardening. Fact 37. Adolf Eichmann considered himself a bureaucrat following orders, and almost got away with it. Adolf Eichmann was not a commander. He was not a camp administrator. He was a logistics coordinator, the head of the subsection of the Reich main security office that handled the transportation of Jewish people to the death camps. His formal title was Chief of the Jewish Office of the Gestapo. He was the man who organized the train schedules, negotiated with railway authorities, coordinated between the SS, the Foreign Office, and the occupation governments in different countries to ensure that the deportation machinery ran as efficiently as possible. He was the desk murderer, operating from an office in Berlin, killing millions through paperwork. Eichmann fled Germany in 1945 with false papers and eventually arrived in Argentina in 1950 under the name Ricardo Clement. He worked for the Buenos Aires Water Company and later for a car manufacturing firm. He had a wife and children. He lived in a modest house in a suburb of Buenos Aires. In 1960, Israeli Mossad agents found him. They had been following leads for years, partly through the work of Simon Wiesenthal and partly through information that had reached Israeli intelligence through other channels. On May 11, 1960, a team of Mossad agents captured Eichmann on a street in Buenos Aires, sedated him, and flew him to Israel concealed on a passenger aircraft. The abduction was an act of sovereignty violation that caused an international diplomatic incident with Argentina. Eichmann was tried in Jerusalem in 1961. The trial was deliberately designed to be public and documented, to create a historical record that would be heard by the widest possible audience. Holocaust survivors testified for the first time in a judicial setting where their accounts were the central evidence. Hannah Arendt covered the trial for The New Yorker and produced her landmark book Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, derived from her observation of Eichmann's flat, bureaucratic self-presentation at trial, became one of the most quoted and most debated concepts in political philosophy. Eichmann was not a sadist. He was not a monster in any visually obvious sense. He was a small, precise, bureaucratically minded man who had organized mass murder with the same attitude he might have brought to organizing a railway schedule. That, Arendt argued, was the real horror. Eichmann was convicted and executed by hanging on May 31, 1962. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered at sea beyond Israeli territorial waters. It was the only execution carried out by the State of Israel in its history. And speaking of the people who organized the transport of victims, let's talk about the process by which millions of people were deceived about where they were going. Fact 38. The Nazis maintained the deception of resettlement until the moment of death. One of the most psychologically significant aspects of the Holocaust operational structure is the elaborate and sustained deception that the Nazis used to prevent resistance, panic, and escape. This deception operated at every scale, from the language used in official communications, which refer to deportees as being relocated or resettled in the East, to the physical architecture of the gas chambers, which were designed to look like shower rooms. The use of deceptive language began at the very top. The official documents of the Third Reich never referred to killing Jewish people in plain language. They used euphemisms, special treatment, resettlement, special action, final solution. This language served partly as security, making documents harder to use as evidence, and partly as a psychological protection for those implementing the policies, allowing them to process what they were doing through bureaucratic abstraction. At the deportation points, Jewish people were told they were being transported to work camps in the East. They were sometimes allowed to bring luggage. They were told they would need warm clothing and food for the journey. These instructions maintained the fiction of resettlement and also served a practical purpose. They made the victims easier to manage and less likely to resist or flee. At the death camps, the deception continued. The buildings were labeled. At Auschwitz, the entrance to the gas chamber undressing room bore a sign saying bath and disinfection. Hooks for clothing were numbered, and the SS told people to remember their hook number to retrieve their belongings afterward. Soap and towels were sometimes handed out. Signs on the walls gave instructions in multiple languages. The ceilings of the gas chambers had fake shower heads installed. The deception was not perfect. Rumors traveled. Arriving prisoners sometimes saw smoke from the crematoria. Some arrived already knowing what the smoke meant. But in many cases, particularly in the early phases of the killing, and particularly among older victims and families with children, the fiction of a shower was maintained until the last moment. This systematic deception is part of why the perpetrators could function as they did. They had organized a system that minimized the moment of visible terror, that processed people through bureaucratic procedures that made the situation seem manageable and official, and that transferred the psychological burden of what was happening away from the perpetrators and onto the victims' shocked incomprehension. And speaking of the specific architecture of death, let's talk about what happened to the physical sites of the Holocaust and what they now hold for us as places of memory. Fact 39. Auschwitz-Birkenau is visited by over 2 million people annually, but most leave not knowing its full-scale Auschwitz-Birkenau is the most visited Holocaust memorial site in the world. More than 2 million people tour the camp complex each year. They walk through the brick buildings of Auschwitz I, the main camp. They see the Iron Gate with its inscription Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. They see the Block 11 punishment building and the standing cells. They see the reconstructed gas chamber. Then they take a bus or walk the 2 kilometers to Auschwitz II, Birkenau, the vastly larger killing and labor camp where most of the murders occurred. Birkenau is enormous. Over 400 acres. The ruins of the crematoria that the Germans blew up in November 1944. The remains of hundreds of prisoner barracks stretching to the horizon. The railway track that runs to the selection platform. The monument at the end of the tracks. What most visitors do not fully comprehend, and what even the most carefully designed memorial cannot fully communicate, is the scale. Auschwitz-Birkenau killed approximately 1.1 million people. 1.1 million people in one camp. The Soviet investigators who liberated it in January 1945 described finding in the warehouses the equivalent of the personal possessions of 1.1 million people. 150,000 women's garments. 50,000 men's suits. Approximately 14,000 pounds of human hair. 348,000 men's suits. 80,000 pairs of shoes. The camp at its peak held approximately 90,000 prisoners at any given time. Tens of thousands more arrived each week on the deportation trains and were killed immediately. At its killing peak in the summer of 1944, during the Hungarian deportations, the camp's crematoria could not process the bodies fast enough, and pits were dug to burn the excess. SS records indicate that on a single day in May 1944, approximately 9,000 people were killed. The memorial at Auschwitz-Birkenau is managed by the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, which was established by the Polish government in 1947. The museum employs educators, historians, and conservators who work to maintain the physical site and develop educational programs. The site was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1979. It continues to deteriorate physically, and significant international funding has been directed toward conservation. Visiting Auschwitz is a specific kind of experience that no description can substitute for. The physical presence of the place, the scale of the barracks, the silence, the preserved shoes and hair and photographs of the people who were killed, does something to the visitor that no film, no book, no podcast can do. If you ever have the opportunity to visit, you should. And speaking of what the physical evidence tells us that documents cannot, let's talk about what archaeologists have been discovering at the death campsites in recent years. Fact 40. Ground-penetrating radar at Sobibor found mass graves that changed what we knew about the camp for decades after the Second World War. The physical sites of the Operation Reinhard camps were largely untouched as archaeological sites. Sobibor was covered by a forest. Treblinka was a memorial park. The deliberate destruction of these camps by the Germans, combined with post-war reluctance to disturb what were essentially mass graves, meant that the physical evidence of what had occurred there remained largely unexamined. Beginning in the early 2000s and accelerating through the 2010s, teams of archaeologists from Israel, Poland, and elsewhere began systematic non-invasive surveys of the Sobibor and Treblinka sites using ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and other techniques that can examine what lies beneath the soil without disturbing it. The results were significant. At Sobibor, surveys conducted between 2000 and 2016 identified the locations of the gas chambers, the mass graves, and the overall camp layout with far greater precision than was previously known. The surveys also found structural evidence of the gas chamber complex and confirmed the accounts of survivors. In 2014, excavations at the site of the gas chamber revealed its foundations, a concrete floor, and the ash and bone fragments of victims. This physical confirmation of the survivors' testimony was important not only for historical knowledge, but as a response to Holocaust deniers who had specifically pointed to the absence of physical evidence at the Operation Reinhardt sites as supposed proof that mass killings had not occurred there. At Treblinka, similar surveys identified mass grave sites containing the remains of hundreds of thousands of people. The legal and ethical questions around excavating sites that are mass graves have meant that most of the physical evidence remains in situ. But the radar and magnetometry surveys have provided a spatial map of the camp that has considerably enhanced our understanding of its operation. These archaeological findings are part of a continuing process of evidence gathering that has been intensifying, not diminishing, as the Holocaust recedes in time. The generation of direct survivors is dying. The witnesses are being replaced by the forensic and documentary record, and that record continues to yield new information, new confirmation, and new specificity about crimes that the perpetrators tried very hard to erase. And speaking of what has been recovered and what remains missing, let's talk about the fate of the Jewish communities of Europe that were destroyed. Fact 41. The Holocaust destroyed entire communities and cultures that can never fully be reconstructed. The Holocaust did not only kill people. It destroyed communities. It erased entire cultures. The Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, which had existed for centuries and had developed rich traditions of scholarship, religious life, music, literature, theater, politics, and philosophy, were annihilated within a period of 3 years. Before the Second World War, there were approximately 9 million Jews in Europe. Of these, approximately 6 million were killed in the Holocaust. The Jewish communities of Poland, the Baltic states, and large portions of Hungary, Romania, Ukraine, and Belarus were effectively annihilated. The Jewish population of Poland, which had been approximately 3.3 million before the war, the largest Jewish community in Europe, was reduced to approximately 250,000 survivors. Many of those survivors subsequently emigrated to Israel or other countries. The Jewish community of Poland, once one of the most vibrant and influential in the world, had been destroyed. With these communities went their specific cultural inheritance. The Yiddish language, which had been spoken by approximately 11 million people worldwide before the Holocaust, was effectively decimated as a living community language. The centers of Yiddish cultural life, Warsaw, Vilnius, Lodz, Krakow, were gone. The great yeshiva academies of Volozhin, Mir, and Ponvez, the schools of Talmudic scholarship that had produced generations of religious leaders and thinkers, were destroyed. The theater, the press, the political movements, the labor unions, the secular and religious institutions that had structured Jewish life in Eastern Europe, all of it was gone. The writer and Holocaust survivor, Elie Wiesel, coined a Hebrew term, churban, destruction, for what had occurred. It is sometimes translated as Holocaust, though the word Holocaust itself, which refers to a burnt offering, has been criticized by some scholars as inappropriate for a murder that was not any kind of offering. The Yiddish term Churban carries a specific weight, connecting the destruction of European Jewry to the destruction of the ancient temple in Jerusalem, positioning the Holocaust within a longer history of catastrophe and survival. What survived of these cultures survived in fragments, in books that were hidden, in rituals maintained in concentration camps against every conceivable obstacle, in music played in the ghettos and the camps by musicians who knew they were likely to die but played anyway, in letters and diaries buried in milk cans in the Warsaw Ghetto. into memories carried by survivors into a post-war world that was not always willing to hear them. And speaking of who was forgotten or excluded from the central Holocaust narrative, let's talk about the non-Jewish victims of Nazi persecution. Fact 42. The Holocaust killed 500,000 Roma people, and their persecution remains less recognized. The Holocaust is primarily remembered and documented as the genocide of the Jewish people. But the Nazi persecution extended to other groups who were targeted for extermination on racial grounds. Among these, the Roma people, also known by the German term Sinti und Roma, experienced a genocide that the Nazis themselves termed the Parajmos, though this word is disputed within the Roma community. The systematic murder of Roma people during the Holocaust is one of the most under-recognized genocides of the 20th century. The Nazis classified Roma as racially inferior, a social, and a biological threat to the German Volk. Beginning in 1935, Roma were subject to many of the same legal restrictions applied to Jews. They were stripped of citizenship, prohibited from marriage with non-Roma Germans, subjected to forced sterilization under racial hygiene laws, and required to register with police. In 1936, Roma were rounded up from German cities and towns and sent to camps specifically for Roma. When the Einsatzgruppen began their killing operations in the occupied Soviet Union in 1941, Roma were included among their victims. Entire Roma communities across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states were shot. Roma were also deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where a specific section of the camp was designated as the Zwischenlager, the Gypsy Camp. In August 1944, when the Zwischenlager was liquidated, approximately 2,900 Roma men, women, and children were killed in a single night. Estimates of the number of Roma killed in the Holocaust range from 220,000 to 500,000, representing between 25 and 50% of the pre-war European Roma population. The variation in the estimates reflects the difficulty of establishing reliable pre-war population figures and the relative lack of documentation compared to the Jewish Holocaust. Roma victims were less frequently recorded by name in German documents. Post-war reparations processes in West Germany initially excluded Roma, treating them as socials rather than racial victims, and did not acknowledge their persecution as racially motivated until 1982. Roma survivors of the Holocaust faced significant barriers in receiving recognition, compensation, and historical acknowledgement. Many lived in poverty and faced discrimination in the post-war period. The Parajmos, as a term for Roma genocide, was not widely adopted in academic or public discourse until the 1990s. Holocaust memorialization at many sites has expanded in recent decades to acknowledge Roma victims, but they remain less present in the dominant Holocaust narrative than their experience warrants. The same pattern of relative invisibility applies to other victim groups. Soviet prisoners of war, of whom approximately 3.3 million died in German captivity through deliberate starvation and neglect. Polish civilians, of whom approximately 1.8 to 2.8 million non-Jewish people were killed. People killed for homosexuality, for political opposition, for physical disability, for religious belief. The Holocaust had multiple victim categories, and the hierarchy of remembrance has not always corresponded to the hierarchy of suffering. Your eyelids are heavy. The histories you've heard tonight press gently on you, asking only to be remembered. Let them settle. Let your breathing slow. We have a few more facts before we reach the end of this journey. Fact 43. Jewish people fought back more than history typically acknowledges. One of the most persistent and harmful distortions in Holocaust memory is the notion that Jewish people went to their deaths without resistance. This idea, sometimes expressed in the phrase like sheep to the slaughter, was hurtful to survivors even when used by other Jewish people, and has been thoroughly challenged by historical research. Jewish resistance during the Holocaust took many forms. Armed resistance, of which the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is the most famous, also occurred at Sobibor and Treblinka, at the Białystok Ghetto, at the Vilna Ghetto, and in dozens of other locations. Jewish partisan units operated in the forests of Belarus, Lithuania, and Ukraine. The Bielski partisans, led by brothers Tuvia, Zuz, and Osel Bielski, sheltered over 1,200 Jewish men, women, and children in the Naliboki forest, creating a community in the forest that survived the war. Their story was the basis of the 2008 film Defiance. Unarmed resistance was equally significant. Cultural resistance, the maintenance of Jewish religious and cultural life in the ghettos and even in the camps, was a form of defiance. Schools operated illegally in ghettos. Synagogue services were held in secret. Oneg Shabbat, the underground archive organized by Emanuel Ringelblum in the Warsaw Ghetto, buried 2 vast caches of documents about Jewish life under occupation, over 2 years of daily cultural, social, and political documentation of the ghetto. These archives were buried in milk cans and metal boxes beneath the ghetto before the uprising. 2 of the 3 caches have been recovered since the war. They are preserved at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw and represent an irreplaceable record of how a community documented its own destruction. Resistance also took the form of smuggling, of escape, of children who carried food into ghettos hidden in clothing, of families who refused to board deportation trains and hid in bunkers beneath their homes, of individuals who maintained their sense of self and humanity against every effort by the Nazi system to strip them of it. The conditions that made organized armed resistance difficult were extreme. The Jewish population had been systematically disarmed, isolated, starved, and deceived. They had no access to weapons, no external allies who would arm them, no safe territory. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and dependent on a surrounding population that was mostly hostile or indifferent. The remarkable thing is not that there was relatively little armed resistance. The remarkable thing is that there was any at all, and that there was so much unarmed resistance of every other kind. And speaking of those who resisted by maintaining their humanity, let's talk about the righteous among the nations. Fact 44. The righteous among the nations. 28,000 recognized, but the true number was far higher. Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, maintains a designation called righteous among the nations for non-Jewish individuals who risked their lives to rescue Jewish people during the Holocaust. As of the time of this writing, Yad Vashem has recognized approximately 28,000 individuals in this category from 51 countries. They include farmers, priests, police officers, diplomats, teachers, and factory owners. Behind each of the 28,000 names is a specific story. Witold Pilecki, a Polish soldier, voluntarily allowed himself to be captured and sent to Auschwitz in 1940 in order to gather intelligence and organize resistance inside the camp. He compiled reports, smuggled them out, and eventually escaped in 1943. His reports were among the earliest detailed accounts of Auschwitz to reach the Allied command. He was executed by the Communist Polish government in 1948, accused of espionage for the West, and his story was suppressed under communism. He was rehabilitated posthumously. Giorgio Perlasca, an Italian businessman stranded in Budapest in 1944, impersonated a Spanish diplomat, issued false Spanish passports to thousands of Hungarian Jews, and ran safe houses that sheltered thousands more, working alongside the actual Spanish and Swedish diplomats conducting rescue operations. He saved an estimated 5,000 people. He returned to Italy after the war and told no one what he had done. He was found in the 1980s by Jewish survivors he had saved, who had spent years looking for him. Chun Sugihara, a Japanese diplomat in Lithuania, defied the instructions of the Japanese Foreign Ministry and issued thousands of visas to Jewish refugees in 1940, allowing them to travel through the Soviet Union to Japan and onward to safety. He issued visas by hand, working 18 hours a day, until the deadline of his departure. As his train pulled out of the station, he was still writing visas and passing them out the window. But the 28,000 recognized by Yad Vashem represent only those whose cases have been documented and verified through survivor testimony and documentary evidence. The actual number of people who helped Jewish individuals survive during the Holocaust, through small acts of hiding, feeding, silence, and misdirection, was certainly higher. Many helpers did not live to be recognized. Many did not consider themselves to be doing anything notable. Many acts of help were never connected to surviving victims. The full landscape of rescue and assistance was larger and more diffuse than the official recognition numbers suggest. And, speaking of what we still do not fully know, let's talk about the specific, documented ignorance that was maintained at the highest levels of Allied government. Fact 45. The U.S. government created a specific agency to rescue Jews in January 1944. It was created 18 months too late. On January 22, 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order creating the War Refugee Board, a government agency specifically mandated to take action to rescue the victims of enemy oppression who are in imminent danger of death. The board worked with private organizations, foreign governments, and neutral countries to facilitate the rescue of Jewish and other persecuted people from Nazi-occupied Europe. The War Refugee Board accomplished significant things in its short existence. It funded and supported the operations of Raoul Wallenberg in Budapest, where the Swedish diplomat issued tens of thousands of protective passports to Hungarian Jews in the second half of 1944 and operated safe houses that sheltered tens of thousands more. The board negotiated with neutral governments. It organized relief efforts. It provided significant organizational and financial support to rescue operations across Europe. But the War Refugee Board was created in January 1944. By that point, approximately 5 million of the Holocaust's eventual 6 million Jewish victims were already dead. The board was created largely as a result of intense pressure from Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. and his colleagues, after an internal Treasury Department report concluded that the State Department had been actively obstructing efforts to rescue Jewish people from Europe, including blocking a proposal by Treasury to provide funds to Jewish organizations in Europe that could have been used for rescue operations. The State Department report, titled Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews, documented that American officials had suppressed information about the extermination of Jews, had blocked rescue proposals, and had actively worked to prevent the public from learning the full scale of what was happening. Morgenthau presented a version of this report to Roosevelt. Roosevelt created the War Refugee Board within weeks. The history of what the American government knew, when it knew it, and what it chose to do with that knowledge is documented in the archives of the State Department, the Treasury, and the War Refugee Board itself. The documents are available. The conclusion is not comfortable. The American government knew. It was told repeatedly, in detail, from multiple sources. And for most of the years of the Holocaust, it chose to treat what it knew as a secondary priority. And speaking of what was known and what was done or not done, let's talk about one of the most disturbing examples of post-war failure. Fact 46. Holocaust denial began almost immediately after the war and was actively organized. The Holocaust was not over before the organized denial of its existence began. Even before the war ended, as the Allies were liberating camps and publishing their findings, and as the Nuremberg trials were assembling their documentation, a coordinated effort was underway to deny, minimize, and distort what had occurred. The first significant post-war Holocaust denial publication was a pamphlet by French writer Maurice Bardèche in 1948, arguing that the Nuremberg trials were victor's justice and that the evidence for systematic extermination was fabricated or exaggerated. Harry Elmer Barnes, an American historian, wrote in the 1950s questioning the scale of the Holocaust. Paul Rasseneur, a French pacifist and concentration camp survivor, produced works through the 1950s and 1960s arguing that the gas chambers had been invented by Jewish propagandists. The development of organized Holocaust denial as a pseudo-academic movement accelerated in the 1970s with the founding in the United States of the Institute for Historical Review, which published a journal and held conferences presenting Holocaust denial as historical revisionism. The ICHR offered a cash prize to anyone who could prove that Jews were gassed at Auschwitz. When survivor Mel Mermelstein submitted documented proof, they refused to pay. He sued. He won. Holocaust denial arguments follow consistent patterns that have been identified and refuted by historians. They focus on the absence or destruction of physical evidence, particularly for the Operation Reinhard camps. They misrepresent or quote out of context the findings of technical reports. They deny or minimize survivor testimony. They offer alternative explanations for the statistical disappearance of millions of people from the European Jewish population. The historical consensus on the Holocaust is among the most thoroughly documented and evidentially established in any area of historical scholarship. The existence of the gas chambers, the systematic nature of the killing, and the death toll of approximately 6 million Jewish victims are supported by a convergence of evidence from Nazi documents, physical evidence, demographic analysis, survivor testimony, bystander accounts, and perpetrator confessions that is essentially irrefutable. Holocaust denial is not a historical controversy. It is a form of anti-Semitism using the tools of pseudo-scholarship. And speaking of what continues to emerge from the historical record even decades later, let's talk about something that was discovered only in the 21st century. Fact 47. Historians discovered in 2013 that there were over 42,000 Nazi ghettos, camps, and other sites. The previous estimate was 7,000. In 2013, researchers at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum published the findings of an extraordinary project, the most comprehensive mapping of the Nazi camp system ever conducted. The project, the result of over 13 years of research by historians Jeffrey Mengele and Martin Dean, documented the full scope of the Nazi system of incarceration, forced labor, and murder. The previous scholarly estimate for the number of camps and ghettos in the Nazi system was approximately 7,000 sites. The USHMM project identified over 42,000. 42,000 distinct sites, including concentration camps, forced labor camps, prisoner of war camps, ghettos, killing centers, euthanasia centers, transit camps, and subcamps. Sites existed in almost every country in occupied or Allied Europe. The system extended from Norway in the north to North Africa in the south, from France in the west to Ukraine in the east. The implications of this finding are significant. The scale of the system makes the claim that ordinary Germans did not know something was happening fundamentally untenable. 42,000 sites means that in any given region of occupied Europe, there were multiple visible, physically present facilities where people were being held, worked, and killed. The sites required guards, administrators, supply chains, and maintenance. They required railway connections, food deliveries, and medical personnel. The infrastructure of the Holocaust was visible. It was present in ordinary communities across a continent. People saw it. The scale of the system also tells us something about the magnitude of the bureaucratic and logistical effort involved. The Holocaust was not a secret operation conducted in isolated locations. It was a vast administrative undertaking that touched the lives and the knowledge of enormous numbers of people across occupied Europe. The USHMM database is publicly accessible. You can search it. You can look up the camps that existed near specific cities and towns. You can read the documentation for sites that were established in neighborhoods that still exist. The 42,000 sites are not abstractions. They are addresses. They are places on maps you could point to. And speaking of what the physical landscape of the Holocaust still contains that is waiting to be found, let's talk about one specific discovery that occurred very recently. Fact 48. Mass graves from the Holocaust are still being discovered. The Holocaust ended in 1945. The recovery of its physical evidence has never ended. In 2019, construction workers in the German city of Cologne discovered human remains while working on a building site near the university. The remains were identified as those of approximately 300 concentration camp prisoners who had been killed near the end of the war. The site had been previously unknown. In Poland, which was the epicenter of the Holocaust's mass killing operations, mass grave sites are regularly identified and documented. A large mass grave near the city of Sobibor was identified through ground-penetrating radar surveys in 2016 and is believed to contain the remains of tens of thousands of victims. In 2019, remains believed to be those of victims of the Poniatoa labor camp massacre of November 1943, in which approximately 14,000 people were shot in a single operation, were identified during construction work. In Lithuania, which had one of the highest proportional rates of Jewish murder in the Holocaust, approximately 96% of the pre-war Jewish population was killed. Mass grave sites are scattered across the country, many in forests and fields that have been built over or farmed for 80 years. A 2016 survey using ground-penetrating radar near the Ponar Forest massacre site in Vilnius identified a previously unknown mass grave. Investigation revealed it was likely connected to a known attempt by prisoners in 1944 to dig an escape tunnel. The remains of the victims of one of the Holocaust's most concentrated killing operations, the murder of approximately 70,000 people at Ponary, are distributed across a Lithuanian forest that people walk through today. The discovery of new mass grave sites is not a symptom of historical ignorance. It is a symptom of the sheer scale of what occurred. 42,000 sites, millions of victims, decades of deliberate concealment, and then decades of agricultural and construction activity over the concealed sites. The physical record of the Holocaust continues to emerge from the earth. And speaking of what the passage of time means for Holocaust memory, let's talk about the survivors, the generation that is now nearly gone. Fact 49. The last generation of direct Holocaust survivors is dying. And what that means for memory, there is a generation of human beings alive today who survived the Holocaust. They were children in the camps, or teenagers who escaped on the Kindertransport, or adults who hid for years in cellars and barns, or fighters who survived the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. They are now in their 80s, 90s, and for the very youngest, their 70s. They will not be with us much longer. This transition from living memory to recorded memory is one of the most significant challenges facing Holocaust education and remembrance. For decades, the testimony of survivors, their physical presence, their specific recollections of specific faces and voices and moments, has been the most powerful tool for making the Holocaust humanly comprehensible. A survivor speaking in a classroom or an assembly, showing the number on their arm, describing what it felt like to stand on the selection platform, what the face of their mother looked like as they were separated for the last time, does something that no film or book can fully replicate. The presence of a person who was there, who lived through it, collapses the 75-year distance in a way that nothing else can. Organizations including the USC Shoah Foundation, founded by Steven Spielberg after the making of Schindler's List, have conducted massive testimony recording programs, capturing the accounts of survivors on video. The Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive contains over 55,000 testimonies in 35 languages. Yad Vashem has collected over 20,000 testimonies. These recordings are enormously valuable. They will outlast the survivors. But testimony recordings are not the same as living survivors. The shift that is occurring as the last generation of direct witnesses dies means that the burden of remembrance shifts to those who knew survivors, to the children and grandchildren of survivors, to the historians and educators and memorial workers, and, yes, to people like those of you listening tonight. The chain of memory passes from living witness to transmitted witness. That transmission is a responsibility. And speaking of what that responsibility means in practice, and how we ensure that the history you have heard tonight is never reduced to a number or a statistic, let's reach our final fact. Fact 50. 6 million is not a number. It is 6 million people. This is the fact that is not really a fact. It is a correction. Throughout the history of Holocaust education, the risk has always been that the numbers overwhelm the individuals. 6 million Jews, 12 million total victims, 900,000 at Treblinka, 33,771 in 2 days at Babi Yar. The numbers are necessary. They convey scale. They refuse minimization. But they can also, if allowed to become purely abstract, function as a shield against the full weight of what they represent. There was a woman named Chana Spiegel who lived in the town of Kielce, Poland. She was a seamstress. She had 3 daughters, Rachel, Sarah, and Leah. Her husband was a tailor. In 1942, when the Kielce ghetto was liquidated, Chana Spiegel and her daughters were deported to Treblinka. None of them survived. They are counted, each of them, in the 6 million. There was a man named Moshe Ettlinger who was a professor of mathematics at the University of Vienna. He published papers on topology. He had a wife named Greta and a son named Anton who was studying medicine. When the Anschluss brought Austria into the Third Reich in March 1938, Moshe Ettlinger lost his professorship. He tried to emigrate. He was unable to obtain a visa to any country that would accept him. In 1942, he and his family were deported from Vienna to Riga. They were killed on arrival. They are counted in the 6 million. There was a girl named Hannah Brady from the Czech town of Nové Mesto na Moravě. She loved skating and drawing and gymnastics. She was sent to Auschwitz in October 1944 at the age of 13 and killed immediately on arrival. A Canadian educator named Karen Levine discovered Hannah's name on a suitcase at a Tokyo Holocaust Education Center and traced her story, publishing it in a book called Hannah's Suitcase in 2002. The book has been translated into 40 languages. It has been read by millions of children across the world. Hannah Brady is counted in the 6 million. Now she's also a name. The obligation of remembrance is not to know the number 6 million. It is to understand that the number is composed of individual human beings, each with a name, a face, a family, a future that was taken from them. Each of the 6 million was someone's child. Most of them were someone's parent, or sibling, or friend, or neighbor. Each one had preferences and fears and memories and dreams. Each one had a voice that spoke specific words in a specific language. And those words are gone now because the person who spoke them is gone. The task of memory is to refuse to let the number stay a number, to keep reaching into it, pulling out individual names and stories and lives, and holding them up to the light long enough for them to be seen, and then to let them rest, gently, in the darkness where all memory eventually lives. That is what Holocaust remembrance asks of us. Not to perform grief, not to perform knowledge, but to understand, truly understand that it happened, that it was done by people to people, that the conditions that made it possible, the dehumanization, the bureaucratic complicity, the institutional silence, the willingness to look away, are not uniquely historical. They are tendencies present in every human society, and that the only defense against them is precisely this: knowing what happened, knowing how it happened, and refusing to pretend that it could not happen again, because it could, and because people who say it could not are often the first people to not see it when it begins.